Story number 1 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The First 4 Kings of Judah. 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 37. Now we turn from the story of the kingdom of Israel in the north to the story of the kingdom of Judah in the south. You read in Story 74 how the 10 tribes broke away from the rule of King Rehoboam and set up a kingdom of their own under Jeroboam. This division left the kingdom of Judah very small and weak. It reached from the Dead Sea westward to the land of the Philistines on the shore of the Great Sea, and from Beersheba on the south not quite to Bethel on the north. But it held some control over the land of Edom on the south of the Dead Sea. Its chief city was Jerusalem, where stood the temple of the land and the palace of the king. After Rehoboam found that he could no more rule over the 10 tribes, he tried to make his own little kingdom strong by building cities and raising an army of soldiers. But he did not look to the Lord as his grandfather David had looked. He allowed his people to worship idols, so that soon on almost every hill and in almost every grove of trees there was an image of stone or wood. God was not pleased with Rehoboam and his people, because they had forsaken him for idols. He brought upon the land of Judah a great army from Egypt, led by Shishak the king of Egypt. They marched over all the land of Judah, they took the city of Jerusalem, and they robbed the temple of all the great treasure in gold and silver which Solomon had stored up. This evil came upon Judah because its king and its people had turned away from the Lord their God. After Rehoboam had reigned 17 years, he died, and his son Abijah became king of Judah. When Jeroboam, the king of Israel, made war upon him, Abijah led his army into the land of Israel. But Jeroboam's army was twice as large as Abijah's, and his men stood not only in front of the men of Judah, but also behind them, so that the army of Judah was in great danger of being destroyed. But Abijah told his men to trust in the Lord and to fight bravely in the Lord's name. And God helped the men of Judah against Israel, and they won a great victory, so that Jeroboam never again came against Judah. Abijah's reign was short, only 3 years, and after him came Asa his son, who was a great warrior, a great builder of cities, and a wise ruler. Against Asa a great army of enemies came up from Ethiopia, which was south of Egypt. Asa drew out his little army against the Ethiopians at a place called Marishah in the south of Judah near the desert. He had no hope of success in his soldiers because they were so few and the enemies were so many. But Asa called upon the Lord and said, "O Lord, it makes no difference to thee whether there are few or many. Help us, O Lord, for we trust in thee, and in thy name we fight this vast multitude. O Lord, thou art our God. Let not man succeed against thee." The Lord heard Asa's prayer and gave him a great victory over the Ethiopians. Asa took again the cities in the south which had gone over to the side of the Ethiopians, and he brought to Jerusalem great riches, and flocks of sheep, and heads of cattle, and camels which he had taken from his enemies. Then the Lord sent to Asa a prophet named Azariah. He said, "Hear me, King Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, you shall find him. But if you forsake the Lord, he will forsake you. Now be strong, and put away the wickedness out of the land, and the Lord shall reward your work." Then Asa rebuilt the altar of the Lord which had fallen into decay, and he called upon his people to worship. He went through the land and broke down the idols and burned them. He found that his own mother, the queen, had made an idol, and he cut it down and broke it in pieces, and he would not allow her to be queen any longer, because she had worshipped idols. Until Asa was old, he served the Lord, but in his old age he became sick, and in his sickness he did not seek the Lord. He turned to men who called themselves physicians or doctors, but they were men who tried to cure by the power of idols. This led many of Asa's people to worship images, so that when he died there were again idols throughout the land. Asa's son Jehoshaphat was the next king, and he was the wisest and strongest of all the kings of Judah, and ruled over the largest realm of any. When he became king, Ahab was king of Israel, of whom we read in part 4. Jehoshaphat made peace with Israel, and united with the Israelites against the kingdom of Syria. He fought against the Syrians in the battle at Ramoth-Gilead, where King Ahab was slain. And afterward, with Ahab's son Jehoram, he fought against the Moabites. Jehoshaphat served the Lord with all his heart. He took away the idols that had again arisen in the land. He called upon his people to worship the Lord, and he sent princes and priests throughout all Judah to read to the people the law of the Lord, and to teach the people how to serve the Lord. The Lord gave to Jehoshaphat great power. He ruled over the land of Edom, over the wilderness on the south, and over the cities of the Philistines upon the coast. And Jehoshaphat chose judges for the cities in all the land, and he said to them, "Remember that you are not judging for men, but for the Lord, and the Lord is with you, and sees all your acts. Therefore fear the Lord, and do his will. Do not allow men to make you presents so that you will favor them, but be just toward all, and be strong in doing right." At one time news came to King Jehoshaphat that some of the nations on the east and south and north, Moabites, Ammonites, and Syrians, had banded together against him, and were encamped with a great army at En-Gedi near the Dead Sea. Jehoshaphat called forth his soldiers, but before they went to battle, he led them to the temple to worship the Lord. And Jehoshaphat called upon the Lord for help, saying, "O Lord, the God of our fathers, art not thou God in heaven? Dost thou not rule over the nations of the earth? Is not power thine, so that none can stand against thee? Now, Lord, look upon these hosts who have come up against thy people. We have no might against this great company, and we know not what to do. But our eyes look toward thee for help." Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon one of the Levites, a man named Jahaziel, and he said, "Hear ye, men of Jerusalem and Judah, and hear, O King Jehoshaphat. Thus saith the Lord, Fear not this great host of your enemies, for the battle is not yours, but the Lord's. Go out against them, but you will not need to fight. You shall stand still and see how the Lord will save you. Do not fear, for the Lord is with you." Then Jehoshaphat and all his people worshipped the Lord, bowing with their faces on the ground. And the next day, when they marched against the enemies, the Levites walked in front, singing and praising the Lord, while all the people answered, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his mercy endureth forever." When the men of Judah came to the camp of their enemies, they found that a quarrel had risen up among them. The Ammonites and the Moabites began to fight with the rest of the bands, and soon all the host were fighting and killing each other. And when the men of Judah came, part of the host were lying dead, and the rest had fled away into the desert, leaving behind them great treasure. So it came to pass, as the prophet Azariah had said, they did not fight, but the Lord fought for them, and saved them from their foes. The place where this strange battle had taken place they named the Valley of Barakah, which means blessing, because there they blessed the Lord for the help that he had given them. And afterward they came back to Jerusalem with songs and praises and the great riches which they had taken. And God gave to King Jehoshaphat peace and rest from his enemies, and great power as long as he lived. End of story number 1.
Story number 2 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lehman Hurlbut. Part 5. The Little Boy Who Was Crowned King. 2 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1 to chapter 24 verse 27. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, was a good man and a wise king. But he made one mistake which brought great trouble upon his family and upon his land in after days. He married his son Jehoram to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and the wicked Jezebel. When Jehoshaphat died and Jehoram became king of Judah, his wife Athaliah led him into all the wickedness of the house of Adam. Jehoram killed all his brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, so that no one of them might rise up against him. His queen Athaliah set up idols all around Jerusalem and in Judah, and led the people in worshipping them. The prophet Elijah was still living in Israel when Jehoram began to reign in Judah. he sent to King Jehoram a letter containing a message from the Lord. He wrote, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of David, because you have not walked in the ways of your father Jehoshaphat, but have walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and have led the people of Jerusalem and of Judah to turn from the Lord to idols, and because you have slain your brothers who were better than you, therefore the Lord will strike you, and your house, and your people, and you shall have a terrible disease that none can cure." And after this great troubles came upon Jehoram and his land. The Edomites on the south, who had been under the rule of Judah since the days of David, broke away from King Jehoram and set up a kingdom of their own. The Philistines on the west and the Arabians of the desert made war upon him. They broke into his palace and carried away all his treasures, and killed all his children except one, the youngest. And upon Jehoram himself fell a sickness that lasted many years and caused him great suffering. No cure could be found, and after long years of pain Jehoram died. So evil had been his reign of 8 years that no one was sorry to have him die, and they would not allow his body to be buried among the kings of Judah. After Jehoram, his youngest son Ahaziah became king. His mother was the wicked Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel. Ahaziah reigned only 1 year, for while he was visiting King Jehoram of Israel, his uncle, he was slain by Jehu, as we read in story 89. For this was the time when Jehu rose against the house of Ahab, killed Jehoram, Ahab's son, and Jezebel, Ahab's widow, and made himself king of Israel. But Jehu gave to the body of Ahaziah a king's burial, for he said, "He was the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart." When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, heard that her son was dead, all the fierceness of her mother Jezebel arose in her. She seized the princes who belonged to the family of David and killed them, so that there was not a man of the royal line left. She made herself queen and ruler over the land of Judah. She shut up the house of the Lord and built a temple for Baal, and for 6 years led the people of Judah in all wickedness. In the slaughter of the royal family by Athaliah, one little child of Ahaziah had been saved alive. His name was Joash. He was a baby, only a year old, when his grandmother Athaliah seized the throne, and his aunt, a sister of Ahaziah and the wife of the priest Jehoiada, hid him in the temple of the Lord, and kept him safe from the hate of Queen Athaliah. There he stayed for 6 years while Jehoiada, the priest, was preparing to make him king. When all things were ready, and little Joash was 7 years old, Jehoiada, the priest, brought him out of his hiding place, and set him before the people and the rulers in the temple, and placed the crown upon his head. Then all the people shouted, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Queen Athaliah heard the noise of the shouting, and came out of her palace to see what had taken place. She saw the little boy king standing by a pillar in the temple, with the crown upon his head, and around him the soldiers and the people crying aloud, "Long live the king!" Athaliah was very angry as she saw this. She called for her servants and her soldiers to break up this gathering of the people, and to take the boy king, but no one would follow her, for they were all tired of her cruel rule, and they wished to have for their king one who came from the line of David. Jehoiada said to the soldiers, "Take this woman a prisoner, and carry her out of the temple of the Lord. Let not her blood be spilled on the holy house." So they seized Athaliah and dragged her out of the temple and killed her. Then Jehoiada and all the people made a promise to serve the Lord only. They tore down the house of the idol Baal and destroyed the images and broke its altar into pieces. They made the temple holy once more and set the house in order, and offered sacrifices and held a daily worship before the altar. And all the people were glad to have a descendant of David, one of the royal line, once more on the throne of Judah. As long as Jehoiada the good priest lived, Joash ruled well, and his people served the Lord. When King Joash grew up, he wished to have the temple of the Lord made new and beautiful, for in the years that had passed since the temple had been built by Solomon, it had grown old and had fallen into decay. Then too Queen Athaliah and the men who worshipped Baal had broken down the walls in many places, and they had carried away the gold and the silver of the temple to use for worship of Baal. At first King Joash told the priests and Levites who served in the temple to go through the land and ask the people for money to be spent in the fitting up of the temple. But the priests and the Levites were slow in the work, and the king tried another plan for getting the money that was needed. He caused a large box, or a chest, to be made, and had it placed at the door of the temple, so that all would see it when they went to worship the Lord. In the lid of the box was a hole through which they dropped money into the box. And the king caused word to be sent through all the land that the princes and the people should bring gifts of money and drop it into the chest whenever they came to temple. The people were glad and brought their gifts willingly, for they all wished to have God's house be made beautiful. In a short time the box was full of gold and silver. Then the king's officers opened the box and tied up the money in bags and placed the bags of money in a safe place. The box was filled with gold and silver many times, until there was money in abundance to pay for all the work needed in the temple, and for making new ornaments of gold and silver for the house. When Jehoiada the good priest was very old, he died, and after his death there was no one to keep King Joash in the right way. The princes of the land loved to worship idols and did not serve God, and they led King Joash into wicked ways after he had done so well. God was not pleased with Joash after he forsook the Lord, and God allowed the Syrians of the north to come upon the land. They robbed the cities and left Joash sick and poor. Soon after the coming of the Syrians, his own servants killed him, and made Amaziah, his son, king in his place. End of story number 2.
Story number 3 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman. Hurlbut Part 5. 3 Kings and a Great Prophet. 2nd Chronicles chapter 25 from verse 1 to verse 27 of chapter 28. Isaiah chapter 6. Amaziah was the 9th of the kings of Judah, if the years of Athaliah's rule be counted as a separate reign. Amaziah worshipped the Lord, but he did not serve the Lord with a perfect heart. He gathered an army of 300,000 men to make war on Edom and bring its people again under the rule of Judah. He hired also an army from Israel to help him in this war. But a prophet said to him, "O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you against Edom, for the Lord is not with the people of Israel. But go with your own men and be strong and brave, and the Lord will help you." "But how will I get back the money that I have paid to the army of Israel?" said Amaziah to the prophet. "Fear not," said the prophet. "The Lord is able to give you much more than you have lost." Then Amaziah obeyed the Lord and sent back the men of Israel to their own land, and went against the Edomites with the men of Judah. The Lord gave him a great victory in the land of Edom. Amaziah was cruel to the people whom he conquered, and killed very many of them in his anger. And when he came back from Edom, he brought with him the idol gods of that land. And although they could not save their own people, Amaziah set them up for his own gods, and burned incense to them and bowed down before them. And when a prophet of the Lord came to him and warned him that God was angry with him and would surely punish him for this wickedness, Amaziah said to the prophet, "Who has asked you to give advice to the king? Keep still, or you will be put to death." And the prophet answered him, "I know that it is God's will that you shall be destroyed, because you will not listen to the word of the Lord." Amaziah's punishment was not long delayed, for soon after this he made war upon Joash, the king of Israel, whose kingdom was far greater and stronger than his own. We read the story of Joash in story 90. The two armies met at Beth Shemesh, northwest of Jerusalem. Amaziah was beaten in a great battle. Many of his men were slain, and Amaziah himself was taken prisoner by Joash, the king of Israel. Joash took the city of Jerusalem and broke down the wall, and carried away all the treasures in the palace and in the temple of the Lord. After this, Amaziah lived 15 years, but he never gained the power that he had lost. His nobles made a plan to kill him, and Amaziah fled away from the city to escape them. But they caught him and slew him, and brought his body back to Jerusalem to be buried in the tombs of the kings. His reign began well, but it ended ill because he failed to obey the word of the Lord. After Amaziah came his son Uzziah, who was also called Azariah. He was the 10th king of Judah. Uzziah was only 16 years old when he began to reign, and he was king for 52 years. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord during most of his reign. Uzziah found the kingdom weak, and he made it strong, for the Lord helped him. He won back for Judah the land of the Philistines, the land of the Ammonites on the east of Jordan, and of the Arabians on the south. He built cities and made strong walls around them, with towers full of weapons for defense against enemies. He loved the fields and planted trees and vineyards, and raised crops of wheat and barley. But when Uzziah was strong and rich, his heart became proud, and he no longer tried to do God's will. He sought to have the power of the high priest as well as that of the king, and he went into the holy place in the temple to offer incense upon the golden altar, which was allowed to the priests only. The high priest Azariah followed Uzziah into the holy place with the other priests and said to him, "It is not for you to offer incense, O King Uzziah, nor to come into the holy place. This belongs to the priests alone. Go out of the holy place, for you have disobeyed the Lord's command, and it will not bring you honor, but trouble." Uzziah was standing before the golden altar with a censer of incense in his hand. Instantly, the white scales of leprosy rose upon his forehead. The priest saw in that moment that God had smitten Uzziah with leprosy. Indeed, he felt it himself and turned to leave the holy place. But they would not wait for him to go out. They drove him out, for the leper's presence made the house unholy. And from that day until he died, Uzziah was a leper. He could no longer sit as king, but his son Jotham took his place. Nor was he allowed to live in the palace, but he stayed in a house alone. And when he died, they would not give him a place among the tombs of the kings, but they buried him in a field outside. Jotham, the 11th king, ruled after his father's death 16 years. He served the Lord, but he did not stop his people from worshipping idols. He was warned by his father's fate and was content to be a king, without trying at the same time to be a priest and to offer incense in the temple. God was with Jotham and gave his kingdom some success. The next king, the 12th, was Ahaz, who was the wickedest of all the kings of Judah. He left the service of God and worshipped the images of Baal. Worse than any other king, he even offered some of his own children as burnt offerings to the false gods. In his reign, the house of the Lord was shut up, and its treasures were taken away, and it was left to fall into ruin. For his sins and the sins of his people, God brought great suffering upon the land. The king of Israel, Pekah, came against Ahaz and killed more than 100,000 of the men of Judah, among them the king's own son. The Israelites also took away many more, men, women, and children, as captives. But a prophet of the Lord in Israel, whose name was Oded, came out to meet the rulers and said to them, "The Lord God was angry with Judah and gave its people into your hand. But do you now intend to keep your brothers of Judah as slaves? Have not you also sinned against the Lord? Now listen to the word of the Lord and set your brothers free and send them home." Then the rulers of Israel gave clothing to such of the captives as were in need, and set food before them, and they sent them home to their own land, even giving to those that were weak among them asses to ride upon. They brought them to Jericho in the valley of the Jordan and gave them to their own people. When the Edomites came against Judah, King Ahaz sent to the Assyrians, a great people far away, to come and help him. The Assyrians came, but they did not help him, for they made themselves the rulers of Judah and robbed Ahaz of all that he had and laid heavy burdens upon the land. At last Ahaz died, leaving his people worshippers of idols and under the power of the king of Assyria. In the days of these three kings, Uzziah, Jotham, and Ahaz, God raised up a great prophet in Judah whose name was Isaiah. The prophecies that he spoke in the name of the Lord are given in the book of Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah was a young man. One day, while he was worshipping in the temple, a wonderful vision rose suddenly before his sight. He saw the form of the Lord God upon a throne, with the angels all around him. He saw also strange creatures called seraphim, standing before the throne of the Lord. Each of these had 6 wings. With 2 wings he covered his face before the glory of the Lord. With 2 wings he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew through the air to do God's will. And these seraphim called out to one another, "Holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the young Isaiah felt the walls and the floor of the temple shaking at these voices. And he saw a cloud of smoke covering the house. Isaiah was filled with fear. He cried out, saying, "Woe has come to me, for I am a man of sinful lips, and I live among a people of sinful lips. And now my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphim took into his hand the tongues that were used in the sacrifices. He flew to the altar, and with the tongues took up a burning coal. Then he flew to the place where Isaiah was standing, and pressed the fiery coal to Isaiah's lips. And he said, "This coal from God's altar has touched your lips, and now your sin is taken away, and you are made clean." Then Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send to these people? Who will bear the message of the Lord to them?" And Isaiah said, "Here am I, Lord, send me." And the Lord said to Isaiah, "You shall be my prophet, and shall go to these people, and shall give to them my words. But they will not listen to you, nor understand you. Your words will do them no good, but will seem to make their hearts hard, and their ears heavy, and their eyes shut. For they will not hear with their ears, nor see with their eyes, nor understand with their hearts, nor will they turn to me and be saved." And Isaiah said, "How long must this be, O Lord?" And the Lord said, "Until the cities are left waste without people, and the houses without men to live in them, and the land shall become utterly desolate, and the people shall be taken far away into another land. But out of all this there shall be a few people, a 10th part, to come back and to rise like a new tree from the roots where the old tree has been cut down. This 10th part shall be the seed of a new people in the times to come." By this Isaiah knew that, though his words might seem to do no good, yet he was to go on preaching, for long afterward a new Judah should arise out of the ruins of the old kingdom, and should serve the Lord. Isaiah lived for many years, and spoke the word of the Lord to his people, until he was a very old man. He preached while 4 kings, perhaps also a 5th, were ruling. Some of these kings were friendly and listened to his words, but others were not willing to obey the prophet and do the will of God. And the kingdom of Judah gradually fell away from the worship of the Lord, and followed the people of the 10 tribes. in the worship of idols. End of story 3.
Story 4 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut. Part 5. The Good King Hezekiah. 2 Kings 18, verse 1 to 20, verse 21. 2 Chronicles 19, verse 1 to 32, verse 33. Isaiah 36, verse 1 to 38, verse 22. After Ahaz, the wickedest of the kings of Judah, came Hezekiah, who was the best of the kings. He listened to the words of the prophet Isaiah and obeyed the commands of the Lord. In the first month of his reign, when he was a young man, he called together the priests and the Levites, who had the charge of the house of the Lord, and he said to them, "My sons, give yourselves once more to the service of the Lord, and be holy as God commands you. Now, open the doors of the house of the Lord, which have been shut for these many years, and take out of the house all the idols that have been placed in it, and make the place clean and pure from all evil things. Because the people have turned away from the Lord, he has been angry with us, and has left us to our enemies. Now let us go back to the Lord, and promise again to serve him. God has chosen you, my sons, to lead in his worship. Do not neglect the work that the Lord has given you to do." Then the temple was opened as of old. The idols were taken away. The altar was made holy to the Lord, and the daily offering was laid upon it. The lamps were lighted in the holy place. The priest stood before the holy altar offering incense. The Levites in their robes sang the psalms of David, while the silver trumpets made music, and the people came up to worship in the temple as they had not come in many years. For an account of the services of worship, see Story 28. You remember that the great feast of the Passover kept in mind how the children of Israel had come out of Egypt. See Story 23. For a long time, the people had ceased to keep this feast, both in Judah and in Israel. King Hezekiah sent commands through all Judah for the people to come up to Jerusalem and to worship the Lord in this feast. He also sent the men through the land of Israel, the 10 tribes, to ask the men of Israel also to come up with their brothers of Judah to Jerusalem and to keep the feast. At that time, Hosea, the last king of Israel, was on the throne. The land was overrun by the Assyrians, and the kingdom was very weak and nearing its end. See Story 87. Most of the people in Israel were worshippers of idols and had forgotten God's law. They laughed at Hezekiah's messengers and would not come to the feast. But in many places in Israel there were some who had listened to the prophets of the Lord, and these came up to worship with the men of Judah. For each family they roasted a lamb, and with it ate the unleavened bread made without yeast, and they praised the Lord who had led their fathers out of Egypt to their own land. After the feast, when the people had given themselves once more to the service of God, King Hezekiah began to destroy the idols that were everywhere in Judah. He sent men to break down the images, to tear in pieces the altars to the false gods, and to cut down the trees under which the altars stood. You remember that Moses made a serpent of brass in the wilderness. See Story 32. The image had been brought to Jerusalem and was still kept there in the days of Hezekiah. The people were worshipping it as an idol and were burning incense before it. Hezekiah said, "It is nothing but a piece of brass," and he commanded that it should be broken up. Everywhere he called upon his people to turn from the idols, to destroy them, and to worship the Lord God. When Hezekiah became king, the kingdoms of Israel and Syria and Judah, with all the lands near them, were under the power of the great kingdom of the Assyrians. Each land had its own king, but he ruled under the king of Assyria, and every year a heavy tax was laid upon the people, to be paid to the Assyrians. After a few years, Hezekiah thought that he was strong enough to set his kingdom free from the Assyrian rule. He refused to pay the tax any longer, and gathered an army, and built the walls of Jerusalem higher, and made ready for a war with the Assyrians. But Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came into the land of Judah with a great army, and took all the cities in the west of Judah, and threatened to take Jerusalem also. Then Hezekiah saw that he had made a mistake. He was not able to fight the Assyrians, the most powerful of all the nations in that part of the world. He sent word to the king of Assyria, saying, "I will no more resist your rule. Forgive me for the past, and I will pay whatever you ask." Then the king of Assyria laid upon Hezekiah and his people a tax heavier than before. To obtain the money, Hezekiah took all the gold and silver in the temple, all that was in his own palace, and all that he could find among the people, and sent it to the Assyrians. But even then the king of Assyria was not satisfied. He sent his princes to Jerusalem with this message: "We are going to destroy this city, and to take you away into another land, a land far away, as we have taken the people of Israel away, and as we have carried captive other peoples. The gods of other nations have not been able to save those who trusted in them against us, and your God will not be able to save you. Now give yourselves up to the great king of Assyria, and go to the land where he will send you." When King Hezekiah heard this, he was filled with fear. He took the letter into the house of the Lord, and spread it out before the altar, and called upon the Lord to help him and to save his people. Then he sent his princes to the prophet Isaiah, to ask him to give them some word from the Lord. And Isaiah said, "Thus saith the Lord, the king of Assyria shall not come to this city, nor shall he shoot an arrow against it. But he shall go back to his own land by the same way that he came. And I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. For I will defend this city, and will save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake." Just at that time Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, heard that a great army was marching against him from another land. He turned away from the land of Judah, and went to meet these new enemies. And the Lord sent upon the army of the Assyrians a sudden and terrible plague, so that in one night nearly 200,000 of them died in their camp. Then King Sennacherib hastened back to his own land, and never again came into the land of Judah, nor did he again send an army there. And years after this, while he was worshipping his idol god in his temple at Nineveh, his chief city, 2 of his sons came upon him, and slew him with the sword. They escaped into a distant land, and Esarhaddon, another of his sons, became king over the lands ruled by the Assyrians. Thus did God save his city and his people from their enemies, because they looked to him for help. At the time while the Assyrians were in the land, and the kingdom was in great danger, Hezekiah was suddenly stricken with a deadly disease. It was a tumor or a cancer which no physician could cure, and the prophet Isaiah said to him, "Thus saith the Lord, set your house in order, and prepare to leave your kingdom, for you shall die, and not live." But King Hezekiah felt that in a time of such trouble to the land he could not be spared, especially as at that time he had no son who could take charge of the kingdom. Then Hezekiah upon his bed prayed to the Lord that he might live, and he said, "O Lord, I beseech thee, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which was good in thy sight. Let me live and not die, O Lord." The Lord heard Hezekiah's prayer, and before Isaiah had reached the middle of the city on his way home, the Lord said to him, "Turn again, and say to Hezekiah, the prince of my people, Thus saith the Lord, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. I will heal you, and in 3 days you shall go up to the house of the Lord. I will add to your life 15 years, and I will save this city from the king of Assyria." Then Isaiah the prophet came again to Hezekiah, and spoke to him the word of the Lord. And he said also, "Lay on the tumor a plaster made of figs, and he shall be cured." When Hezekiah heard the words of Isaiah, he said, "What sign will the Lord give, to show that he will cure me, and that I shall again go up to the house of the Lord?" And Isaiah said, "The Lord will give you a sign, and you shall choose it yourself. Shall the shadow on the dial go forward 10 degrees, or go back 10 degrees?" Near the palace was standing a sundial, by which the time of the day was shown, for there were no clocks in those years. And Hezekiah said, "It is easy for the shadow to go forward 10 degrees. Let it go back 10 degrees. Then Isaiah the prophet called upon the Lord, and the Lord heard him, and caused the shadow to go backward on the sundial 10 degrees. And within 3 days Hezekiah was well, and went to worship in the house of the Lord. After this, Hezekiah lived 15 years in honor. When he died, all the land mourned for him as the best of the kings. End of Story 4. Story 5 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Lost Book Found in the Temple. 2 Kings 21 verse 1 to 23 verse 25. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 1 to 35 verse 27. Manasseh, the 14th king of Judah, followed the sins of his grandfather Ahaz, and not the good deeds of his father Hezekiah. He was only 12 years old when he began to reign, too young for so great a care as the kingdom, and in his youth he turned away from the teachings of the prophet Isaiah and from the service of the Lord. He built again the altars to Baal and Asherah, which his father Hezekiah had thrown down. He worshipped the sun, the moon, and stars. He set up images even in the temple, the house of the Lord. When Manasseh grew older and had children of his own, he made them go through the fire, seeking to please the false gods. He would not listen to the prophets whom the Lord sent to warn him, and there is reason to believe, though the Bible does not say it, that he put to death the good prophet Isaiah. And Manasseh in his wickedness reigned a long time, longer than any of the wicked kings who had gone before him, so that he led his people further away from God than even Ahaz, who had been as wicked as Manasseh. Because of Manasseh's sins and the sins of his people, the Lord brought upon the land the generals of the Assyrian army with their host. They took Manasseh a prisoner and bound him with chains and carried him to the city of Babylon, where the king of Assyria was then living. There Manasseh was kept a prisoner for a long time. While he was in prison, Manasseh saw how wicked he had been, and he sought the Lord. He prayed to be forgiven for his sins, and the Lord heard him. Afterward, the king of Assyria allowed Manasseh to rule over his land again. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was the only true God, and from that time he worshipped the Lord only. He took the altars and the images of the false gods out of the temple, and built again the altar of the Lord, and caused the offerings to be laid upon it. He commanded his people to worship the Lord and to leave the idols, but they had gone too far to come back, and only a few of them followed their king's example in seeking the Lord. He could easily lead his people into sin, but he could not bring them back to God. After a long reign of 55 years, Manasseh died, and his son Amon became king. He reigned only 2 years, but they were years of wickedness and of worshipping idols. Then his servants in his own house killed Amon, but the people killed them in turn, and made his son Josiah king. Josiah, the 16th king, was only 8 years old when his father Amon was slain. At first he was too young to rule over the land, and the princes of his court governed in his name. But when Josiah was 16 years old, he chose the Lord God of his father David, the God whom Hezekiah had worshipped, and he served the Lord more fully than any of the kings who had gone before him. When he was 20 years old, he began to clear away the idols and idol temples from the land of Judah. He did this work more thoroughly than it had ever been done before, by Jehoshaphat or by Hezekiah, for he left in all the land not a single place where idols were worshipped. He went even beyond his own borders, into the land that had been the land of Israel, from which most of the people had been carried away captive long before. And in every place he broke down the altars and burned the images, and even dug up the bones of the idol priests and burned them with their images. He came to Bethel, 12 miles north of Jerusalem, where Jeroboam of Israel had built the temple for the worship of the golden calves 200 years before. See Story 75. There, as he was burning the bones of the idol priests upon the ruins of their own altars, he found a tomb and asked who was buried there. They said, "This is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and warned King Jeroboam of one who would do these very things that you are doing." "Let his bones rest," said King Josiah. "Let no man touch the bones of the prophet." While the men of King Josiah were at work in the temple on Mount Moriah, taking away the idols and making the house pure once more, they found an old book written upon rolls of leather. It was the book of the law of the Lord, given by Moses, but it had been hidden so long that men had forgotten it. They brought the book and read from it aloud to the king. And when King Josiah heard the words of the law, and the warning of the woes that were to come upon the people for disobeying them, the king was filled with alarm. He said to the rulers, "Go and ask of the Lord for me and for all the people. Great is the anger of the Lord against us, because our fathers have disobeyed the words of the Lord written in this book." They sought for a prophet to give them the word of the Lord, and they found a woman named Huldah living in Jerusalem, to whom the word of the Lord came. She was called a prophetess, and they brought to her the message of King Josiah. And the prophetess Huldah said to them, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Go and tell the man who has sent you, Behold, I will bring evil on this place and on the people living in it, because they have forsaken the Lord and have worshipped other gods. My anger will fall upon this city and upon this land. But because King Josiah has sought the Lord and has done God's will, and he has called upon the Lord, therefore the Lord says that he will hold back his anger against this city and this land as long as Josiah lives, and he shall go down to his grave before all these evils come upon Judah and Jerusalem." When Josiah heard this, he called all the princes and the priests and the people to meet in the temple of the Lord. There the king stood by a pillar and read to all the people the words of the book that had been found. Then the king and all his people made a promise to serve the Lord and to do his will and to keep his law with all their hearts. And this promise they kept while Josiah lived, but that was only a few years. All this time the kingdom of Judah, like all the kingdoms around, was a part of the greater kingdom or empire of Assyria. But the great kings of Assyria had passed away, and now the kingdom or empire of Assyria was becoming weak and falling apart. Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, went to war with the Assyrians, and on his way passed through the land of Judah, and what had once been Israel before its people were carried away captive. Josiah thought that as the king of Assyria was his overlord, he must fight against the king of Egypt, who was coming against him. Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, sent a message to King Josiah, saying, "I have nothing against you, O king of Judah, and I am not coming to make war on you, but on the king of Assyria. God has sent me and commanded me to make haste. Do not stand in my way, or you may be destroyed." But Josiah would not heed the message of the king of Egypt. He went out against him with his army, and met him in battle on the great plain of Esdraelon, where so many battles had been fought before, and have been fought since. There the Egyptians won a victory, and in the fight the archers shot King Josiah. He died in his chariot, and they brought his dead body to Jerusalem. And all the land mourned and wept for the king whom they loved because he had ruled wisely and well. And with the good King Josiah died the last hope of the kingdom of Judah. End of story 5.
Story number 6 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut. Part 5. The Last 4 Kings of Judah and the Weeping Prophet. From 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 31 to chapter 25 verse 22. 2 Chronicles 36 verses 1 to 21. Jeremiah 22 verses 10 through 12. Chapter 24 verses 1 to 10. Chapter 29 verses 1 to 29. And chapter 36 verse 1 to chapter 43 verse 13. When the good King Josiah fell in battle, the people of the land made his son Jehoahaz king. At that time all the kingdoms around Judah were in confusion. The great empire of Assyria had been the ruler of nearly all that part of the world, but now it had been broken up. Nineveh, its chief city, had been destroyed, and Egypt, Babylonia, and other lands were at war, each striving to take the place of Assyria as the ruler of the nations. Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, whose warriors had slain King Josiah, became for a time the master of the lands between Egypt and the Euphrates River. He felt that he could not trust the young King Jehoahaz, and he took his crown from him and carried him a captive down to Egypt, so that Jehoahaz, the 17th king, reigned only 3 months. The prophet Jeremiah, who arose during Josiah's reign, spoke thus of the young king who so soon was taken away as a prisoner. "Weep not for the dead King Josiah, nor sorrow over him, but weep for him that goeth away, the King Jehoahaz, for he shall return no more, nor shall he again see his own land. In the place where they have led him captive, there shall he die, and he shall look upon this land no more." The man whom Pharaoh Necho set up as king over Judah in the place of Jehoahaz was his brother Jehoiakim, another son of Josiah. But he was not like his father, for he lived most wickedly, and led his people back to the idols which Josiah had tried to destroy. Jeremiah the prophet spoke to him the words of the Lord, and warned him that the evil way in which he was going would surely end in ruin to the king and the people. This made King Jehoiakim very angry. He tried to kill the prophet, and to save his life Jeremiah was hidden by his friends. Jeremiah could no longer go out among the people, nor stand in the temple to speak the word of the Lord. So he wrote upon a roll God's message, and gave it to his friend Baruch to read before the people. While Baruch was reading it, some officers of the king came and took the roll away, and brought it to the king. King Jehoiakim was sitting in his palace, with the princes around him, and a fire was burning before him, for it was the winter time. The officer began to read the roll before the king and the princes, but when he had read a few pages, the king took up a knife and began cutting the leaves and throwing them into the fire. Even the princes were shocked at this, for they knew that the writing on the roll was God's word to the king and the people. They begged the king not to destroy the roll, but he would not heed them. He went on cutting up the roll and throwing it in the fire until it was all burned. The king told his officers to take Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch, who read his words, and he would have killed them if he had found them. But they were hidden, and he could not find them, for the Lord kept them in safety. Jehoiakim reigned a few years as the servant of the king of Egypt. But soon the Egyptians lost all the lands that they had gained outside of their own country, and the Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, rose to power over the nations, and took the place of empire that had been held by the Assyrians. Nebuchadnezzar was the son of the king of Babylon, and at first was the general of his army. He came against Judah and Jerusalem, but Jehoiakim did not dare to fight with him. He promised to serve Nebuchadnezzar, and on that condition was allowed to remain king. But no sooner had the Babylonian army gone away than he broke his promise, and rose against Babylon, and tried to make himself free. But in this King Jehoiakim did not succeed. Instead, he lost his kingdom and his life, for either by the Babylonians or by his own people he was slain, and his dead body, like that of a beast, was thrown outside the gate of the city. He had reigned in wickedness 11 years, and he died in disgrace. Jehoiakim's young son, Jehoiakim, who was also called Coniah or Jeconiah, was then made king by the people. But he reigned only 3 months, for Nebuchadnezzar, who was now the king of Babylon, and was conquering all the lands, came with his army, and took the city of Jerusalem. He carried the young king a captive to Babylon, as Necho had carried Jehoahaz a captive to Egypt 11 years before. With King Jehoiakim were taken away many of the nobles and rulers, and the best people of the land. Most of these were worshippers of the Lord, who carried with them to the land of Babylonia a love for the Lord, and who served him there, for their trouble only drew them closer to their God. After these captives had been taken away, the Lord showed to Jeremiah in the temple a vision of what should come to pass. Jeremiah saw 2 baskets of figs. One basket was full of fresh, ripe figs, the best that could be found. The other basket was full of poor, decayed figs, not fit to be eaten. The Lord said, "Jeremiah, what do you see?" And Jeremiah said, "Figs, the good figs very good, and the bad figs very bad, figs so bad that they cannot be eaten." Then the Lord said to Jeremiah, "Like these good figs are the captives who have been taken away to the land of Babylon. I will care for them and keep them, and will bring them again to this land. I will give them a heart to know me, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And the bad figs are like those who are left in this land, the king who shall reign over them, and his princes and his people. They shall suffer, and shall die by the sword, and by famine, and by plague, until they are destroyed." God showed Jeremiah in this way that the captives in Babylon were the hope of the nation. And afterward Jeremiah sent a letter to these captives, saying, "Thus saith the Lord to those who have been carried away captive, Build houses, and live in them, and plant gardens, and eat the fruit of them, and have sons and daughters, and let your children be married in that land when they grow up, and pray the Lord to give peace to the city and the land where you are living, for you and your children shall stay there 70 years, and after 70 years they shall come again to their own land in peace. For my thoughts, saith the Lord, are thoughts of peace and kindness toward you. You shall call upon me, and I will hear you. You shall seek me and find me, when you seek me with all your heart." After Jehoiakim and the captives had been taken away, Nebuchadnezzar set up as king in Judah Zedekiah, the uncle of Jehoiakim and another son of Josiah. He was the 20th and last king of the kingdom of Judah. He began by promising to be true and faithful to his overlord Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who had made him king. But very soon he was led by the nobles who stood around his throne to break his promise and to throw off the rule of Babylon. Also he left the worship of the Lord, as did his people, and began to pray to the idols of wood and stone that could give him no help. Jeremiah the prophet told King Zedekiah that he was doing wickedly in breaking his promises and in turning from the Lord to idols. He told Zedekiah that he would fail, and would bring his kingdom to ruin. He said, "It is better to obey the king of Babylon than to fight against him, for God will not bless you and your people in breaking your word. The king of Babylon will come and will destroy this city. You shall see him face to face, and he will take you away a captive to his own land, and this city shall be destroyed." This made the princes and nobles very angry against Jeremiah. They said, "This man Jeremiah is an enemy of his land and a friend to the king of Babylon. He is a traitor and should be put to death." Zedekiah said to his nobles, "Jeremiah is in your hands. You can do with him what you choose. The king cannot help him against you." Then these men seized Jeremiah and took him to the prison, and threw him into a dungeon down below the floor and filled with mud and filth, into which the prophet sank. And there they left him to die. But in the court of the king there was one kind man, a negro named Ebedmelech. He found Jeremiah in the dungeon, and let down to him a rope, and drew him up, and brought him to a safe and dry place, though still in the prison. By this time Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and his army were again before the city of Jerusalem, laying siege to it. No one could go out or come in. No food could be found for the people, and many of them starved to death. The soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar built forts, and threw darts and stones, and broke down the gates, and made great openings in the walls of the city. When King Zedekiah saw that the city must fall before its enemies, he tried to escape. But the men of Babylon followed him, and took him prisoner, and with him all his family, his wives, and his sons. They were all brought before King Nebuchadnezzar, so that it came to pass, as the prophet had said, Zedekiah saw the king of Babylon. But he saw what was more terrible. He saw all his sons slain before him. Then Zedekiah's eyes were put out, and a blinded captive he was dragged away to Babylon. The Babylonian soldiers killed all the leaders of the people who had led Zedekiah to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, and the rest of the people, except the very poorest in the land, they took away to the land of Babylon. The king of Babylon was friendly to Jeremiah the prophet because of the advice that he had given to Zedekiah and his people. The ruler whom Nebuchadnezzar set over the city opened the door of Jeremiah's prison, and allowed him to choose between going to Babylon with the captives or staying with the poor people in the land. Jeremiah chose to stay, but not long after he was taken down to Egypt by enemies to the king of Babylon. And there in Egypt Jeremiah died. Some think that he was slain. His life had been sad, for he had seen nothing but evil come upon his land, and his message from the Lord had been a message of woe and wrath. Because of his sorrow, Jeremiah has been called the weeping prophet. Nebuchadnezzar carried all that was left of the valuable things in the temple, and then he burned the buildings. He tore down the walls of Jerusalem and set the city on fire. So all that was left of the city of David and the temple of Solomon was a heap of ashes and blackened stones. And thus the kingdom of Judah ended, nearly 400 years after Rehoboam became its first king. End of story number 6.
Story 7 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut. Part 5. What Ezekiel saw in the valley. Ezekiel chapter 37. All that was left now of the people of Judah was a company of captives, carried away from their own land to the land of Babylon. Theirs was a long, sorrowful journey, with their wives and children, dragged by cruel soldiers over mountains and valleys almost 1,000 miles. They could not go straight across the vast desert which lies between the land of Judah and the plains of Babylonia. They were led around this desert far to the north, through Syria, up to the Euphrates River, and then, following the great river in all its windings down, to the land of their captivity. There, in the land of Babylonia, or Chaldea, they found rest at last. When they were once in their new home, the captives met with less trouble than they had feared. For the people of the land under Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, treated them kindly and gave them fields to work in as their own. The soil was rich, and they could raise large crops of wheat and barley and other grains. They planted gardens and built for themselves houses. Some of them went to live in the cities and became rich, and some were in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar and rose to high places as nobles and princes, standing next to the king in rank and honor. And the best of all was that these captives, in a strange land, did not worship idols. They saw the images of the Babylonian gods all around them, but they did not bow down to them. They worshipped the Lord God of their fathers, and the Lord only. The idol worshippers in Judah had been slain, and most of the captives were good men and women, who taught their children to love and serve the Lord. And these people did not forget the land from which they had come. They loved the land of Israel, and they taught their children to love it by singing songs about it. Some of these songs which the captive Jews sang in the land of Chaldea, are in the book of Psalms. Here is a part of one of these songs. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Upon the willow trees in the midst of that land we hanged up our harps. For there they that led us captive asked us to sing, and they that wanted us asked us to be glad, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her skill, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember thee, if I do not prefer Jerusalem above my chief joy. From this time these people were called Jews, a name which means people of Judah, and the Jews everywhere in the world belong to this people, for they have sprung or descended from the men who once lived in the land of Judah. And because they had once belonged to the 12 tribes of Israel, and 10 of the tribes had been lost, and their kingdom had forever passed away, they were also spoken of as Israelites. So from this time, people of Judah, Jews, and Israelites all mean the people who had come from the land of Judah and their descendants after them. God was good to his people in the land of Babylon or Chaldea, another name by which this country was called. He sent to them prophets who showed to them the way of the Lord. One of these prophets was Daniel, a young man who lived in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. Another was a priest named Ezekiel, who lived among the captive people beside a river in Chaldea called the river Kidron. God gave to Ezekiel wonderful visions. He saw the throne of the Lord and the strange creatures with 6 wings that the prophet Isaiah had seen long before. And he heard the voice of the Lord telling him of what should come to his people in the years to come. At one time, the Lord lifted up Ezekiel and brought him into the middle of a great valley. The prophet looked around and saw that the valley was covered with the bones of men, as though a great battle had been fought upon it, and the bodies of the slain had been left there, and they had become a vast army of dry bones. Son of man, spoke the voice of the Lord to Ezekiel, can these dry bones live again? And Ezekiel answered, O Lord, thou knowest whether these dry bones can live. Then the Lord said to Ezekiel, Preach to these dry bones, O son of man, and say to them, O ye dry bones, hear the voice of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, I will send breath into you, and you shall live, and I will put flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and you shall be alive again, and know that I am the Lord. Then Ezekiel spoke to the army of dry bones spread over the valley, as the Lord bade him speak. And while he was speaking, there sounded a noise of rolling thunder, and all through the field the different bones began to come together, one part to another part, until they were no more loose bones, but skeletons of bones fitted together. Then another change came. Suddenly the flesh grew over all the bones, and they lay on the ground like an army of dead men, a host of bodies without life. Then the Lord said to Ezekiel, Speak to the wind, O son of man, speak, and say, Come from the 4 winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. Then Ezekiel called upon the wind to come, and while he was speaking, the dead bodies began to breathe. Then they stood up on their feet, a great army of living men, filling the whole valley. Then the Lord said to Ezekiel, Son of man, these dry bones are the people of Israel. They seem to be lost and dead and without hope, but they shall live again, for I, the Lord, will put life into them, and they shall go back to their own land and be a people once more. I, the Lord, have spoken to it, and I will do it. When Ezekiel told the captive people this vision, their hearts were lifted up with a new hope that they should see their own land again. End of story 7.
Story number 8 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Jewish Captives in the Court of the King, from Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 49. In Story 97, we read of Jehoiakim, the wicked son of the good King Josiah. While Jehoiakim was ruling over the land of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the great conqueror of the nations, came from Babylon with his army of Chaldean soldiers. He took the city of Jerusalem and made Jehoiakim promise to submit to him as his master, a promise that Jehoiakim soon broke. And when Nebuchadnezzar went back to his own land, he took with him all the gold and silver that he could find in the temple, and he carried away as captives very many of the princes and nobles, the best people in the land of Judah. When these Jews were brought to the land of Chaldea or Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar gave order to the prince who had charge of his palace to choose among these Jewish captives some young men that were of noble rank, and beautiful in their looks, and also quick and bright in their minds, young men who would be able to learn readily. These young men were to be placed under the care of wise men, who should teach them all that they knew, and fit them to stand before the king of Babylon, so that they might be his helpers to carry out his orders, and the king wished them to be wise, so that they might give him advice in ruling the people. Among the young men thus chosen were 4 Jews, men who had been brought from Judah. By order of the king the names of these men were changed. One of them, Daniel, was to be called Belteshazzar. The other 3 young men were called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 4 young men were taught in all the knowledge of the Chaldeans, and after 3 years of training they were taken into the king's palace to stand before the king. After they came to the palace, the chief of the princes in the palace sent to these men as a special honor some of the dishes of food from the king's table, and some of the wine that was set apart for the king and his princess to drink. But both the meat and the wine of the king's table had been a part of the offerings to the idols of wood and stone that were worshipped by the Chaldeans. These young Jews felt that if they should take such food, they too would be worshipping idols. Then, too, the laws of the Jews were very strict with regard to what kind of food might be eaten and how it should be cooked. Food of certain kinds was called unclean, and the Jews were forbidden to touch it. These young Jews, far away from their own land and from their temple, felt that they must be very careful to do nothing forbidden by the laws which God had given to their people. They said to the chief of the nobles in the palace, "We cannot eat this meat and drink this wine, for it is forbidden by our laws." The chief of the nobles said to Daniel, "If you do not eat the food that is given you, the king will see that you are not looking well. He will be angry with me for not giving you better care. What shall I do? I am afraid that the king may command me to be put to death." Daniel said, "Give us vegetable food, and bread. Let us eat no meat, and drink no wine for 10 days, and see if we do not look well fed." The chief of the nobles, to whose care these young men had been given, loved Daniel, as everyone loved him who knew him. So he did as Daniel asked. He took away the meat and the wine, and gave to these young Jews only vegetables and bread. At the end of 10 days, the 4 young men were brought into the room where the great King Nebuchadnezzar sat, and they bowed low before him. King Nebuchadnezzar was pleased with these 4 young men, more than with any others who stood before him. He found them wise, and faithful in the work given to them, and able to rule over men under them. And these 4 men came to the highest places in the kingdom of the Chaldeans. And Daniel, one of these men, was more than a wise man. He was a prophet, like Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah. God gave to him to know many things that were coming to pass, and when God sent to any man a dream that had a deep meaning, like Joseph in Story 16, Daniel could tell what was the meaning of the dream. At one time King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed a dream which troubled him greatly. When he awakened he knew that the dream had some deep meaning, but in the morning he had forgotten what the dream was. He sent for the wise men who had in times past given him the meaning of his dreams, and said to them, "O ye wise men, I have dreamed a wonderful dream, but I have forgotten it. Now tell me what my dream was, and then tell me what it means, for I am sure that it had a meaning." The wise men said, "O king, may you live forever. If you will tell us your dream, we will tell you its meaning, but we have no power to tell both the dream and its meaning. That only the gods can know." The king became very angry, for these men had claimed that their gods gave them all knowledge. He said, "Tell me the dream, and its meaning, and I will give you rich reward and high honor. But if you cannot tell, I shall know that you are liars, and you shall be put to death." The wise men could not do what the king asked, and in great fury he gave command that all of them should be slain. Among these men were Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 4 Jews were to be slain with the rest of the wise men. Daniel said to the chief captain, who had been sent to kill the wise men, "Give me a little time, and I will call upon my God. I know that he will help me to tell to the king his dream and its meaning." So time was given, and Daniel and his 3 friends prayed to the Lord God. That night the Lord gave to Daniel the secret of the king's dream and its meaning. Then Daniel gave praise and thanks to the Lord, and in the morning he said to the king's captain, "Do not kill the wise men. Take me before the king, and I will show him his dream and its meaning." Then in haste Daniel was brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. The king said to him, "Are you able to tell me the dream that I dreamed, and the meaning of it?" Daniel answered, "The wise men of Babylon, who look to their idol gods, cannot tell the king his dream. But there is a God in heaven who knows all things, and he has given me his servant to know your dream, and the meaning of it. This is the dream, O king. You saw a great image, tall and noble looking. The head of this image was of gold, his breast and his arms were of silver, his waist and his hips of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet and toes were of iron and clay mixed together. And while this great image was standing, you saw a stone cut out without hands, and the stone rolled and dashed against the feet of the image, and the whole image fell down, and was broken in pieces, and was crushed and ground into a powder so fine that the wind blew it away like chaff. And you saw the stone that struck the image grow until it became a mountain, and it filled the whole world. This was your dream, O king." And Daniel went on and said, "And this, O king, is the meaning of the dream. God has shown to you what shall come to pass in the years that are to be. You are that head of gold, O king, for that head means your kingdom that now is. After your kingdom has passed away, another kingdom shall take its place, the shoulders and arms of silver. That kingdom shall be followed by another, the waist and hips of brass, and after that shall come one more kingdom, that of iron. But as you saw a stone cut out without hands, so while the last of these kingdoms shall be standing, the Lord God of heaven shall set up his kingdom. And God's kingdom, like that stone, shall be small at first, but it shall break down and destroy all those kingdoms. They shall pass away and perish before it. And as you saw the stone grow into a mountain, so God's kingdom shall become great, and shall rule all the lands, and that kingdom of God shall never pass away, but shall last forever." When King Nebuchadnezzar heard this he was filled with wonder. He bowed down before Daniel and worshipped him, as though Daniel were a god. Then he gave to him great presents, and made him ruler over the part of his kingdom where the city of Babylon was standing. He gave to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends, high offices, but Daniel himself he kept in his palace, to be near him all the time. End of story number 8.
Story number 9 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Golden Image and the Fiery Furnace. Daniel 3, 1-30. At one time King Nebuchadnezzar caused a great image to be made and to be covered with gold. This image he set up as an idol to be worshipped on the plain of Dura near the city of Babylon. When it was finished, it stood upon its base or foundation almost 100 feet high, so that upon the plain it could be seen far away. Then the king sent out a command for all the princes and rulers and nobles in the land to come to a great gathering, when the image was to be set apart for worship. The great men of the kingdom came from far and near and stood around the image. Among them, by command of the king, were Daniel's 3 friends, the young Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. For some reason, Daniel himself was not there. He may have been busy with the work of the kingdom in some other place. At one moment in the service before the image, all the trumpets sounded, the drums were beaten, and music was made upon musical instruments of all kinds, as a signal for all the people to kneel down and worship the great golden image. But while the people were kneeling, there were 3 men who stood up and would not bow down. These were the 3 young Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knelt down before the Lord God only. Many of the nobles had been jealous of these young men because they had been lifted to high places in the rule of the kingdom, and these men, who hated Daniel and his friends, were glad to find that these 3 men had not obeyed the command of King Nebuchadnezzar. The king had said that if anyone did not worship the golden image, he should be thrown into a furnace of fire. These men who hated the Jews came to the king and said, "O king, may you live forever! You gave orders that when the music sounded everyone should bow down and worship the golden image, and that if any man did not worship he should be thrown into a furnace of fire. There are some Jews whom you have made rulers in the land, and they have not done as you commanded. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They do not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage and fury at knowing that any one should dare to disobey his words. He sent for these 3 men and said to them, "O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, was it by purpose that you did not fall down and worship the image of gold? The music shall sound once more, and if you then will worship the image, it shall be well. But if you will not, then you shall be thrown into the furnace of fire to die." These 3 young men were not afraid of the king. They said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we are ready to answer you at once. The God whom we serve is able to save us from the fiery furnace, and we know that he will save us. But if it is God's will that we should die, even then you may understand, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image that you have set up." This answer made the king more furious than before. He said to his servants, "Make a fire in the furnace, hotter than ever it has been before, as hot as fire can be made, and throw these 3 men into it." Then the soldiers of the king's army seized the 3 young Jews as they stood in their loose robes with their turbans or hats on their heads. They tied them with ropes and dragged them to the mouth of the furnace and threw them into the fire. The flames rushed from the open door with such fury that they burned even to death the soldiers who were holding these men, and the men themselves fell down bound into the middle of the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar stood in front of the furnace and looked into the open door. As he looked, he was filled with wonder at what he saw, and he said to the nobles around him, "Did we not throw 3 men bound into the fire? How is it then that I see 4 men loose, walking in the furnace, and the 4th man looks as though he were a son of the gods?" The king came near to the door of the furnace as the fire became lower, and he called out to the 3 men within it, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye who serve the Most High God, come out of the fire and come to me." They came out and stood before the king, in the sight of all the princes and nobles and rulers, and every one could see that they were alive. Their garments had not been scorched, not their hair singed, nor was there even the smell of fire upon them. The king Nebuchadnezzar said before all his rulers, "Blessed be the God of these men, who has sent his angel and saved their lives. I make a law that no man in all my kingdoms shall say a word against their God, for there is no other God who can save in this manner. And if any man speaks a word against their God, the Most High God, that man shall be cut in pieces, and his house shall be torn down." And after this the king lifted up these 3 young men to still higher places in the land of Babylon. End of story number 9.
Story number 10 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Tree That Was Cut Down and Grew Again. Daniel 4, 1-37. This is the story that King Nebuchadnezzar himself told to all the people in the great kingdom, of a strange dream that came to him, the meaning of the dream as it was given by Daniel, and how the dream came true. He said, Nebuchadnezzar the king sends this message to all the people and nations that live in all the world. May peace be given to you. It has seemed good to me to show you the signs and wonders that the Most High God has sent to me. His kingdom is without end, and his rule is from age to age forever. I, King Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house, and was living at peace in my palace. One night a dream came to me, which made me afraid, and my thoughts and my visions made me troubled in heart. I sent for all the wise men of Babylon to come before me, and tell me what was the meaning of my dream. But they did not tell me what the meaning was, because they could not. At last came Daniel, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and to him I said, O Daniel, master of the wise men, I know that in you is the spirit of the holy gods, and that no secret is hidden from you. Now tell me, what is the meaning of the dream that has come to me? This was the dream. I saw a tree standing upon the earth. It grew until the top of it reached up to heaven, and it was so great that it could be seen over all the earth. The leaves of it were beautiful, and its fruit was in plenty, and gave food for all. The beasts in the field stood in its shadow, and the birds of the heaven lived on its branches, and many people ate of its fruit. I saw in my dream that a Holy One came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, Hew down the tree, and cut off its branches, shake off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get away from beneath it, and let the birds fly from its branches. But leave the stump of the tree, with its roots in the ground, with a band of iron and of brass around it, and the grass of the field growing about it. Let the stump be wet with the dew from heaven, and let it be among the beasts eating the grass of the field. And let 7 years pass over it, that those who live may know that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of men, and gives them as is pleasing to his will. This dream I saw, and now, O Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, tell me what it means. Then Daniel stood, surprised and wondering, and was in deep trouble. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, said to him, Daniel, let not the dream give you trouble. Fear not to tell me what is the meaning of it. Then Daniel said to me, My lord, O king, may the dream be to those who hate you, and the meaning to your enemies. The tree which you saw, with green leaves and rich fruit, and height reaching to heaven, and in sight of all the earth, that tree is yourself. You have become great, your power reaches up to heaven, and your rule is over all the lands. And as you saw a Holy One coming down from heaven, saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump in the earth, with a band of iron and of brass until 7 years pass over it, this is the meaning, O king, and it is the command of the Most High God that shall come upon my lord the king. You, O king, shall be driven away from men. You shall live with the beasts of the field, you shall be made to eat grass like oxen, you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 years shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High God rules in your kingdom, and gives it to the one whom he chooses. And as the Holy One gave command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots, so it shall be with you. Your kingdom shall stand, and shall be sure to you, and shall come back to you when you have known that he who sits in the heavens shall rule over the earth. And now, O king, take my advice, and break off from your sins, and do right, and show mercy to the poor. It may be that God will give to you more days of peace. All this Daniel said to me, King Nebuchadnezzar, and it came to pass. 12 months afterwards I was walking in my kingly palace. I looked over the city, and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for my own royal home, by my power and for my own glory? While the word was in my mouth, a voice fell from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, the word has been spoken, and your kingdom is gone from you. And in that hour my reason left me, and another heart was given to me, the heart of a beast instead of the heart of a man. I was driven out of my palace, and lived among the beasts, and ate the grass as oxen eat it, and my body was wet with the dew of heaven, until my hair was grown like eagle's feathers, and my nails like birds' claws. And at the end of 7 years my mind came back to me, and my reason returned. I blessed the King of heaven, and praised him that lives forever. My kingdom was given to me once more, my princes and rulers came to me again, and I was again the king over all the lands. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and honor the King of heaven. His words are truth, and his works are right, and those who walk in pride he is able to make humble. This was the story of the 7 years' madness of King Nebuchadnezzar, and of his reason and his power coming back to him again. End of story number 10.
Story number 11 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Writing Upon the Wall. Daniel 5, verses 1 to 31. The great kingdom or empire of Nebuchadnezzar was made up of many smaller kingdoms which he had conquered. As long as he lived, his kingdom was strong, but as soon as he died it began to fall in pieces. His son became king in his place, but was soon slain, and one king followed another quickly for some years. The last king was named Nabonidus. He made his son Belshazzar king with himself, and left Belshazzar to rule in the city of Babylon, while he was caring for the more distant parts of the kingdom. But a new nation was rising to power. Far to the east were the kingdoms of Media and Persia. These two peoples had become one, and were at war with Babylon, under their great leader, Cyrus. While Belshazzar was ruling in the city of Babylon, Cyrus and his Persian soldiers were on the outside, around the walls, trying to take the city. These walls were so great and high that the Persian soldiers could not break through them. But inside the city were many who were enemies of Belshazzar and were friendly to Cyrus. These people opened the gates of Babylon to Cyrus. At night he brought his army quietly into the city and surrounded the palace of King Belshazzar. On that night King Belshazzar was holding in the palace a great feast in honor of his god. On the tables were the golden cups and vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, and around the table were the king, his many wives, and 1,000 of his princes and nobles. They did not know that their city was taken, and that their enemies were at the very doors of the palace. While they were all drinking wine together, suddenly a strange thing was seen. On the wall appeared a great hand writing letters and words that no one could read. Every eye was drawn to the spot, and all saw the fingers moving on the wall, and the letters written. The king was filled with fear. His face became pale and his knees shook. He called for the wise men of Babylon, who were with him in the palace, to tell what the writing meant. He said, "Whoever can read the words on the wall shall be dressed in a purple robe, and shall have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall rank next to King Belshazzar as the third ruler in the kingdom." But not one of the wise men could read it, for God had not given to them the power. At last the queen of Babylon said to Belshazzar, "O king, may you live forever. There is one man who can read this writing, a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, a man whom Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made master of all the wise men. His name is Daniel. Send for him, and he will tell you what these words are and what they mean." Daniel was now an old man, and since the time when Nebuchadnezzar died, he had been no longer in his high place as ruler and chief adviser of the king. They sent for Daniel, and he came. The king said to him, "Are you that Daniel who was brought many years ago by my father to this city? I have heard of you, that the spirit of the holy gods is upon you, and that you have wisdom and knowledge. If you can read this writing upon the wall and tell me what it means, I will give you a purple robe and a gold chain and a place next to myself as the third ruler in the kingdom." And Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your rewards yourself, and may give your gifts to whom you please, for I do not want them. But I will read to you the writing. O king, the Most High God gave to Nebuchadnezzar this kingdom and great power and glory. But when Nebuchadnezzar became proud and boasted of his greatness, then the Lord took from him his crown and his throne, and let him live among the beasts of the field until he knew that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of men. O Belshazzar, you knew all this, yet you have not been humble in heart. You have risen up against the Lord, and have taken the vessels of his house, and have drunk wine in them in honor of your own gods of wood and stone. But you have not praised the Lord God, who has given to you your kingdom and your power. For this reason God has sent this hand to write these words upon the wall. This is the writing: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And this is the meaning: numbered, numbered, weighed, divided. Mene, God has counted the years of your kingdom and has brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and have been found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and taken from you and given to the Medes and the Persians. King Belshazzar could scarcely believe what he heard, but he commanded that the promised reward be given to Daniel. And almost while he was speaking, his end came. The Persians and the Medes burst into his palace. They seized Belshazzar and killed him in the midst of his feast. On that night the empire or great kingdom set up by Nebuchadnezzar came to an end. A new empire arose, greater than that of Babylon, called the Persian Empire. And in the place of Belshazzar, Cyrus, the commander of the Persians, made an old man named Darius king until the time when he was ready to take the kingdom for himself. This empire of Persia was the third of the world kingdoms of which we read in the Bible. The first was the Assyrian kingdom, having Nineveh for its capital. This was the kingdom that carried the 10 tribes of Israel into captivity. The second was the Babylonian or Chaldean kingdom, which carried the Jews into captivity. And the third was the Persian kingdom, which lasted 200 years, ruling all the lands named in the Bible. End of Story 11.
Story number 12 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. Daniel in the Den of Lions. Daniel 6, 1-28. The lands, which has been the Babylonian or Chaldean Empire, now became the Empire of Persia, and over these Darius was the king. King Darius gave to Daniel, who was now a very old man, a high place in honor and in power. Among all the rulers over the land, Daniel stood first, for the king saw that he was wise and able to rule. This made the other princes and rulers very jealous, and they tried to find something evil in Daniel, so that they could speak to the king against him. These men knew that 3 times every day Daniel went to his room and opened the window that was toward the city of Jerusalem, and looking toward Jerusalem made his prayer to God. Jerusalem was at that time in ruins, and the temple was no longer standing, but Daniel prayed 3 times each day with his face toward the place where the house of God had once stood, although it was many hundreds of miles away. These nobles thought that in Daniel's prayers they could find a chance to do him harm, and perhaps cause him to be put to death. They came to King Darius and said to him, "All the rulers have agreed together to have a law made that for 30 days no one shall ask anything of any god or any man except from you, O king, and that if any one shall pray to any god or shall ask anything from any man during 30 days except from you, O king, he shall be thrown into the den where the lions are kept. Now, O king, make the law and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed, for no law among the Medes and Persians can be altered." The king was not a wise man, and being foolish and vain, he was pleased with this law, which would set him even above the gods. So, without asking Daniel's advice, he signed the writing, and the law was made, and the word was sent out through the kingdom that for 30 days no one should pray to any god or ask a favor of any man. Daniel knew that the law had been made, but every day he went to his room 3 times and opened the window that looked toward Jerusalem and offered his prayer to the Lord, just as he had prayed in other times. These rulers were watching nearby, and they saw Daniel kneeling in prayer to God. Then they came to the king and said, O King Darius, have you not made a law that if any one in 30 days offers a prayer, he shall be thrown into the den of lions? It is true, said the king. The law has been made, and it must stand. They said to the king, There is one man who does not obey the law which you have made. It is that Daniel, one of the captive Jews. Every day Daniel prays to his God 3 times, just as he did before you signed the writing of the law. The king was very sorry for what he had done, for he loved Daniel, and he knew that no one could take his place in the kingdom. All day until the sun went down he tried in vain to find some way to save Daniel's life. But when evening came, these men again told him of the law that he had made, and said to him that it must be kept. Very unwillingly the king sent for Daniel, and gave him order that he should be thrown into the den of lions. He said to Daniel, Perhaps your God, whom you serve so faithfully, will save you from the lions. They led Daniel into the mouth of the pit where the lions were kept, and they threw him in. And over the mouth they placed a stone, and the king sealed it with his own seal and with the seals of his nobles, so that no one might take away the stone and let Daniel out of the den. Then the king went again to his palace, but that night he was so sad that he could not eat, nor did he listen to music as he was used to listen. He could not sleep, for all through the night he was thinking of Daniel. Very early in the morning he rose up from his bed and went in haste to the den of lions. He broke the seal and took away the stone, and in a voice full of sorrow he called out, scarcely hoping to hear any answer except the roaring of the lions. O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to keep you safe from the lions? And out of the darkness in the den came the voice of Daniel, saying, O king, may you live forever. My God has sent his angel, and has shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because my God saw that I had done no wrong. And I have done no wrong toward you, O king. The king was glad. He gave to his servants orders to take Daniel out of the den. Daniel was brought out safe and without harm, because he had trusted fully in the Lord God. Then, by the king's command, they seized those men who had spoken against Daniel, and with them their wives and their children, for the king was exceedingly angry with them. They were all thrown into the den, and the hungry lions leapt upon them and tore them in pieces as soon as they fell upon the floor of the den. It was very cruel and unjust to put to death with these men their wives and children, who had done no wrong, either to King Darius or to Daniel. But cruel and unjust as it was, such things were common in all the lands of that part of the world. The lives of people were but little cared for, and children often suffered death for their parents' crime. After this, King Darius wrote to all the lands and the peoples in the many kingdoms under his rule. May peace be given to you all abundantly. I make a law that everywhere among my kingdoms men fear and worship the Lord God of Daniel, for he is the living God above all other gods, who only can save men. And Daniel stood beside King Darius unto the end of his reign, and afterward, while Cyrus the Persian was king over all the lands. Daniel lived for a number of years after being saved from the lions. He had several wonderful dreams and visions, which showed him what would come to pass many years afterward, and even to the coming of Jesus Christ. End of story number 12.
Story number 13 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Story of a Joyous Journey. Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 3 verse 7. We have seen in the story of the kingdom of Israel, or the 10 tribes, how the great empire of Assyria arose from the city of Nineveh on the Tigris River, how it ruled all the lands and carried away the 10 tribes of Israel into captivity, from which they never came back to their own land. Story 91. We saw too how the empire of Assyria went down, and the empire of Babylon, or Chaldea, arose in its place under Nebuchadnezzar. Story 97. As soon as Nebuchadnezzar died, the empire of Babylon began to fall, and in its place arose the empire of Persia, under Cyrus, who is called Cyrus the Great, because of his many victories and his wide rule. His empire was much greater than either the Assyrian or the Chaldean empire, for it held in its rule the land of Egypt, all the lands known as Asia Minor, and also many lands in the far east. Cyrus the great king was a friend to the Jews, who at this time were still living in the land of Chaldea, between the Tigris and Euphrates River. It was now 70 years since the first company of captives had been taken away from the land of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar. See Story 97. And 50 years since the city of Jerusalem had been burned. By that time the Jews were no longer looked upon as captives in the land of Chaldea. They lived in their own houses and tilled their own farms, and were in peace. Many of them were rich, and some of them, like Daniel and his 3 friends, were in high places at the court of the king. You remember that in the early days of the captivity, Jeremiah the prophet wrote a letter to those who had been carried away to Babylon, telling them that after 70 years they would come back to their own land. Story 97. The 70 years were now ended. The older men and women who had been taken away had died in the land of Chaldea, but their children and their children's children still loved the land of Judah as their own land, although it was so far away. The Lord put into the heart of Cyrus, the king of Persia, very early in his reign, to send word among the Jews that they might now go back to their own land. This was the word as it was written and sent out. Thus saith Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has commanded me to build him a house in Jerusalem, in the land of Judah. Therefore let those of the people of God who are among you go up to Jerusalem, and help to build the house of the Lord. And those who do not go to Jerusalem, but stay in the places where they are living, let them give to those who go back to their own land gifts of gold and silver, and beasts to carry them, and goods, and also a free gift toward the building of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. At this, the Jews in the land of Chaldea were very glad, for they loved their own land, and longed to see it. One of them wrote a song at this time. It is Psalm 126. When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like unto them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the nations, The Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Turn again our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. Though he goeth on his way weeping, bearing forth the seed, he shall come again with joy, bringing his sheaves with him. So the Jewish people began to make ready for going back to their own land. Those who were rich and noble in rank stayed in the land of Chaldea and in other lands of the Persian Empire. But though they did not go back to the land from which their fathers had come, they gave large gifts of gold and silver to help those who did go. And Cyrus, the king, took from the treasure house in Babylon all the vessels of the temple that had been taken away by Nebuchadnezzar, and gave them to the Jews, to be used in the new temple which they were soon to build. These were plates and dishes and bowls and cups of gold and silver, more than 4,000 in all. So with the gifts of the king and the gifts of their own people, and what was owned by those who went to the land of Judah, the company took away a vast treasure of gold and silver. It was a happy company of people that met together for the journey back to the land which they still called their own, though very few of them had seen it. There were 42,000 of them, besides their servants to help them in the journey. They traveled slowly up the Euphrates River, singing songs of joy, until they reached the northern end of the great desert. Then they turned toward the southwest and journeyed beside the Lebanon mountains, past Damascus and through Syria, until at last they came to the land of their fathers, the land of Judah. With all their joy they must have felt sad when they saw the city of Jerusalem all in ruins, its walls broken down, its houses heaps of blackened stone, its once beautiful temple burned into a heap of ashes. As soon as they came, they found the rock where the altar of the Lord had stood, the same rock where David had long before offered a sacrifice. See Story 69. And the same rock upon which travelers look even in our time under the dome of the rock. From the smooth face of this rock they gathered up the stones, and swept away the ashes and the dust. Then they built upon it the altar of the Lord. And Joshua, the high priest, began to offer the sacrifices which for 50 years had not been placed upon the altar. Every morning and every afternoon they laid on the altar the burnt offering, and thus gave themselves to the Lord, and asked God's help. From this time there were two branches of the Jewish race. Those who came back to the land of Judah, which was also called the land of Israel, were called Hebrews, which was an old name of the Israelites. Those who stayed in the lands abroad, in Chaldea and throughout the empire of Persia, were called the Jews of the dispersion. There were far more of the Jews abroad than in their own land, and they were the richer and the greater people. Many of them went up to Jerusalem to visit and to worship, and many others sent rich gifts, so that between the two great branches of the Jewish people, in their own land and in other lands, there was a close friendship, and they all felt, wherever the Jews were, they were still one people. The Jews who had been captives in the land of Babylon were now free to go wherever they chose, and besides those who went back to the land of their fathers, there were many who chose to visit other lands, wherever they could find work and get gain. It was not many years before Jews were found in many cities of the Persian Empire. They went also to Africa, and also to Europe, choosing the cities for their home rather than the country. Everywhere in all the great cities the Jews of the dispersion were found, besides those who were living in their own land of Israel. When the Jews came back to their land, their leader was named Zerubbabel, a word which means one born in Babylon. He belonged to the family of David, and was called the Prince, but he ruled under the commands of Cyrus, the great king. For Judah, which now began to be spoken of as Judea, was a small part, or province as it was called, in the great empire of Persia. End of Story 13.
Story number 14 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The New Temple on Mount Moriah. Ezra chapter 3 from verse 8 to chapter 6 of verse 22. Haggai chapter 1 from verse 1 to verse 23 of chapter 2. Zechariah chapter 4 from verse 6 to 10. After the Jews came back to their own land, they first built the altar upon Mount Moriah, as we read in the last story. Then they built some houses for themselves, for the winter was coming on. And early in the next year, they began to build again the temple of the Lord. Zerubbabel the prince and Joshua the priest led in the work, and the priests and Levites helped in it. They gave money to masons and carpenters, and they paid men of Tyre and Sidon on the shore of the Great Sea to float down cedar trees from Mount Lebanon to Joppa, and from Joppa they carried them up the mountains to Jerusalem for the building of the house. When they laid the first stones in the new building, the priests in their robes stood ready with trumpets, and the Levites with cymbals, to praise the Lord for his goodness in bringing them once again to their own land. The singers sang, "Praise the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endureth forever toward Israel his people." And all the people shouted with a great shout as the first stones were laid. But some of the priests and Levites and Jews were old men who had seen the first temple while it was still standing, more than 50 years before. These old men wept as they thought of the house that had been burned and of their friends who had been slain in the destruction of the city. Some wept and some shouted, but the sound was heard together, and those who heard at a distance could not tell the weeping from the shouting. But these builders soon found enemies and were hindered in their work. In the middle of the land, near the cities of Shechem and Samaria, were living the Samaritan people, some of whom from the old 10 tribes, and others from the people that had been brought into the land by the Assyrians many years before. See Story 91. These worshipped the Lord, but with the Lord they worshipped other gods. These people came to Prince Zerubbabel and said, "Let us join with you in building this house, for we seek the Lord as you do, and we offer sacrifices to him." But Zerubbabel and the rulers said to them, "You are not with us, and you do not worship as we worship. You have nothing to do with us in building the Lord's house. We will build up ourselves to our God, the God of Israel, as Cyrus the king of Persia has told us to build." This made the people of Samaria very angry. They tried to stop the Jews from building, and frightened them, and wrote letters to the king urging him to stop the work. Cyrus the king was a friend to the Jews, but he was in a land far away in the east, carrying on war, so that he could not help them, and soon after this he died. His son, who took his great kingdom, did not care for the Jews, and he too died in a few years. Then a nobleman of another family seized the throne and held it nearly a year before he was slain. His name was Smerdis, but he is called in the Bible by another name, Artaxerxes. While this king was reigning, the Samaritan rulers wrote to him a letter saying, "Let it be known to the king that the Jews have come back to Jerusalem. They are building again the city which was always bad, and would not obey the kings when he was standing before. If that city be built and its walls finished, then the Jews will not serve the king nor pay to him their taxes. We are true to the king, and we do not wish to see harm come to his rule. Of old time this city was rebellious, and for that cause it was laid waste. If it is built again, soon the king will have no power anywhere on this side of the river Euphrates." The king Smerdis, or Artaxerxes, wrote an answer to the chief men of Samaria thus: "The letter which you sent has been read to me. I have caused search to be made in the records, and I find that the city of Jerusalem has been in old time a strong city, with great kings ruling in it, and ruling also the lands around it. I find too that this city did rise up and make war against the kings of empires in the past. Command the men who are building the city of Jerusalem to stop the work, and let it not go on until an order is given from the king." The Samaritans and other enemies of the Jews were glad to have this letter come from the great king of Persia. They went to Jerusalem and made the work of building the temple and the city stop. So the foundations of the temple lay unfinished through several years. But after a time, 2 prophets arose in the land of Judea. They were Haggai and Zechariah, and they spoke the word of the Lord to the people, telling them to go forward with the building. Haggai said, "Is it a time for you to dwell in richly furnished houses of your own, while the Lord's house lies waste? Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build, and I will be pleased with you and will bless you, said the Lord. The glory of this house shall be greater than the glory of the other house, and in this place I will give peace, saith the Lord of hosts." And Zechariah the other prophet said, "It shall not be by might nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands shall finish it. He shall lay the headstone with shoutings of grace, grace unto it." Then Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the Jews began again and went on with the work. Soon after this, a new king began to reign in Persia. He was a wise man and a great ruler, whose name was Darius. King Darius looked in the records of Persia and found it written that Cyrus the king had commanded the temple to be built. He wrote a letter to the rulers in all the lands around Judea, no longer to hinder the work, but to help it and to give what was needed for it. Then the Jews went on with the building in great joy, and it was finished at last, 21 years after it had been begun, while Zerubbabel the prince and Joshua the priest were still ruling over the people. The temple, which was thus built for the second time, was like the one built by Solomon nearly 500 years before. See Story 72. But though larger, it was not so beautiful nor costly. In front of it was an open court, with a wall around it, where the people could go to worship. Next to the people's court, on higher ground, was the priest's court, where stood the altar and the laver for washing. Within this court rose the house of God, with the holy place and the holy of holies, separated by a great veil. In the holy place, as before, stood the table for bread, the golden lampstand, and the golden altar for incense. But in the holy of holies there was no ark of the covenant, for this had been lost and was never brought back to Jerusalem. In place of the ark stood a marble block, upon which the high priest sprinkled the blood when he went into the holy of holies on the great day of atonement once each year. See the account of the tabernacle and its worship in Story 28. This is the end of Story 14.
Story number 15 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Beautiful Queen of Persia. Esther 1 verse 1 to 10 verse 3. When Darius the great king died, his son Xerxes, who is called in the Bible Ahasuerus, took his place upon the throne of Persia. Ahasuerus was not, like his father Darius, a wise man. He was hasty in his temper and did many foolish acts. At that time the palace where the king of Persia lived was no longer at Babylon, but at a city named Shushan, among the mountains of a region called Elam. King Ahasuerus held at Shushan a great feast with his nobles. When the king and his company were all drunken with wine, he sent for his queen Vashti, that he might let all the nobles see how beautiful she was. Among the Persians it was held to be very wrong for a woman ever to allow her face to be seen by any man except her husband. Queen Vashti refused to come to the feast, that these drunken men might stare at her. This made the king very angry. He said that because Vashti would not obey him, she should not be queen any longer, and he put her away from him and from his house. After this, King Ahasuerus thought to choose another woman to be his queen instead of Vashti. He sent commands throughout all the kingdom that in every land and province they should find the most beautiful young women and bring them to the royal city of Shushan. There the king would see them all, and among them he would choose the one that pleased him best, and would take her as his queen. So from every land in the great empire of Persia the loveliest young women were brought to Shushan, and there they were left in the care of Hegai, the chief of the king's palace. At that time many Jews were living in the cities of Persia, for we have seen that only a small part of the Jews went back to the land of Israel when King Cyrus allowed them to return. See Story 104. There was a Jew living in Shushan named Mordecai. He belonged to the tribe of Benjamin, and came from the same family and line with Saul, the first of the kings of Israel. At the house of Mordecai lived his cousin, a young girl named Hadassah, or Esther, a name which means star. Her father and mother had died, and she had been left alone, so Mordecai took her to his own house and brought her up as his own daughter. Esther was very beautiful, and was as lovely in her heart as she was in her face. Among the other beautiful young women she was taken to the palace as one of those who were to be brought before the king. When King Ahasuerus saw Esther, the Jewish girl, he loved her, and chose her out of all the young women to be his queen, and set upon her head the royal crown of Persia. Esther was taken into the king's palace. Rooms and servants were given to her, and she lived in the state of a queen. When the king wished to see her, he sent for her, and she came to his room. No one could go to the king or could see him unless sent for. And if any one, man or woman, came before the king without being called, that person was seized by the guards, and was led away to death, unless the king held out toward him his golden scepter, the rod which he held. In the palace Mordecai could no longer meet his cousin Esther, for no man except the king could enter the rooms set apart for the woman. But Esther from her window could see Mordecai as he walked by, and by her servants she could send word to him, and in the same way could hear word from him. Mordecai loved the lovely young queen, who was to him as a daughter, and every day sat at the gate of the palace to hear from her. When Mordecai was sitting by the gate, he saw two men who were keepers of the gate, often whispering together. He watched them closely, and found that they had made a plan to kill King Ahasuerus. He sent word of this to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king of it. The men were taken, and as Mordecai's words was found to be true, they were both slain by being hanged on a tree. And an account or story of all their plan, of how they were found out by Mordecai the Jew, and how they were punished by death, was written in the book of records of the kingdom. After this a man named Haman rose to great power in the kingdom. The king gave him a seat above all the other princes, and asked his advice in all matters, and allowed Haman to do whatever he pleased. Of course everybody in the palace showed great respect to Haman, the man who stood next to the king. When he came near, all the men in the palace and in the city bowed down before him, and many fell on their faces, even in the very dust. But Mordecai was a worshipper of God, and he would not fall upon his face before any man. Haman noticed that there was one man who did not bow down, as did the others around him. He said to his servants, "Who is that man sitting by the gate, who does not bow down when I pass by?" They answered Haman, "That is Mordecai the Jew." But they did not tell Haman, for they did not know that Mordecai was the cousin of Queen Esther, and that the queen of Persia herself was a Jewess. When Haman found that Mordecai was a Jew, he became very angry, not only at Mordecai, but at all his people. He hated the Jews, and he resolved to have revenge on Mordecai, and on his account to make all Mordecai's people suffer. Haman went in to the king and said to him, "O King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad throughout your kingdom, and apart from all other peoples. Their laws are different from those of every other nation, and they do not keep the king's laws. It is not well to allow such a people to live. If it is pleasing to the king, let a law be made that this strange people be destroyed. I will myself pay all the costs of putting them to death, and will place the money in the king's treasury." The king, living in his palace, and never going out among his people, knew nothing of the Jews, and believed Haman's words. He took from his hand the ring on which was the royal seal, and gave it to Haman, saying, "Do as you please. Write whatever law you wish, and stamp it with the king's seal. The money is yours, and I give this strange people to you. You can do with them as you please." Then, by Haman's command, a law was written and sealed with the king's ring, that on a certain day, which was the 30th day of the 12th month, all the Jews in every part of Persia might be slain. Any one who chose to kill them might do so, and those who killed them might take for their own all their money, the gold and silver, and garments which they might find in the houses of the Jews. The copies of this law were sent to every city of the empire of Persia, to be read everywhere, so that all might know that the Jews were to be destroyed. Everyone who heard of it was filled with wonder, for no one knew of any evil against the king that the Jews had done to deserve death. They could not understand why the law had been made, but everywhere the enemies of the Jews made ready to destroy them, that they might have the Jews' riches, for in those times, even as now, there was great wealth among the Jews. The news of this terrible law came to Mordecai, as it came to all the Jews in Shushan. Mordecai tore his clothes, as was the manner of those in deep grief. He put on the garments of sackcloth, he covered his head with ashes, and he went forth in front of the palace, crying a loud and bitter cry. Queen Esther saw him and heard his voice. She sent one of her servants, named Hattash, to Mordecai, to find out why he was in such deep trouble. Hattash came to Mordecai, and Mordecai told him of the law for killing the Jews on a certain day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and gave him a copy of it to show to Queen Esther. And he told Hattash to ask the queen in his name to go in to King Ahasuerus and beg him to spare the lives of her people. Queen Esther heard Hattash's words and sent this message to Mordecai. It is the rule of the palace that if any man or woman shall go into the king in his own room without being sent for by the king, he shall be slain unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter. But I have not been called to meet the king for 30 days. When Mordecai heard this message, he sent word again by Hattash to Queen Esther. Do not think that in the king's palace you are safe, and shall escape the fate of your people. If you keep still and do nothing to save your people, God will surely save them in some other way, and you and your father's family shall be destroyed. Who can tell whether God has not raised you up and given you your royal place for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this answer to Mordecai. Go and bring together all the Jews in Shushan, and let them all pray for me, eating and drinking nothing for 3 days. I and my maids in the palace will pray and fast also at the same time. And then I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if it be God's will that I should die in trying to save my people, then I will die. When Mordecai heard those words, he was glad, for he felt sure that God would save his people through Queen Esther. For 3 days all the Jews in Shushan met together, praying, and in the palace Esther and her servants were praying at the same time. The 3rd day came, and Esther dressed herself in all her robes as queen. She went out of her rooms and across the open court, and entered the door in the front of the throne where the king was sitting. The king saw her standing before him in all her beauty, and his heart was touched with love for her. He held out toward her the golden rod or scepter that was in his hand. Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, What do you wish, Queen Esther? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom. But Esther did not at once ask for all that was in her heart. She was very wise, and she said, If it pleases the king, I have come to ask that the king and Haman, the prince, shall come this day to a dinner that I have made ready for them. The king said, Send word to Haman that he haste and come to dine with the king and queen. So that day King Ahasuerus and Haman sat at the table with the queen. She was covered with a veil, for even Haman was not allowed to look upon her face. While they were sitting together, the king said, Queen Esther, is there anything that you wish? It shall be given to you, whatever it is, even to half of the kingdom. My wish, answered the queen, is that the king and Haman shall come again to dinner with me tomorrow. Haman walked out of the palace that day, happy at the honor that had come to him. But when he saw Mordecai sitting by the gate, and not rising up to bow before him, all his gladness passed away, and he was angry in his heart. When he came to his own house, he told his wife Zeresh and his friends how the king and the queen had honored him, and then he said, But all this is as nothing to me when I see that man Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. But his wife said to him, That is nothing. Before you go to the feast tomorrow, have a gallows made, and then ask the king to command that Mordecai be hanged upon it. The king will do whatever you wish, and then, when you have sent Mordecai to death, you can be happy at your feast with the king and the queen. This was very pleasing to Haman, and on that very day he caused the gallows to be set up, ready for hanging Mordecai on the next day. It so happened that on that night the king could not sleep. He told them to read in the book of records of the kingdom, hoping that the reading might put him to sleep. They read in the book how Mordecai had told of the 2 men who had sought to murder the king. The king stopped the reading and said, What reward has been given to Mordecai for saving the life of the king from these men? O king, they answered, nothing has been done for Mordecai. Then the king said, Is any one of the princes standing outside in the court? Yes, O king, was answered, the noble Haman is in the court. Haman had come in at that very moment to ask the king that Mordecai might be put to death. The king sent word to Haman to come in, and as soon as he entered, said to him, What shall be done to any man whom the king wishes especially to honor? Now Haman thought within himself, "There is no man whom the king will wish to honor more than myself." Then he said, "The man whom the king wishes especially to honor, let him be dressed in the garments of the king, and let him sit on the horse that the king rides upon, and let the royal crown be set upon his head. Let him ride through the main street of the city, and let one of the nobles call out before him, 'This is the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Make haste and do all this that you have said to Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. See that nothing is left out of what you have spoken." Haman was astonished and was cut to the heart, but he did not dare speak as he felt. He obeyed the king's command, sent for the king's horses, his robes, and his crown, dressed Mordecai like a king, mounted him on the horse, and went before him through the streets of Shushan, calling aloud, "This is the man whom the king delights to honor." And after that Haman hid his anger and his sorrow of heart, and sat down to the feast in the queen's palace. He had not said a word to the king of having Mordecai hanged upon the gallows which he had set up the day before. King Ahasuerus knew very well that his queen had still some favor to ask, and at the feast he said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? Tell me, and I will give it to you, even though it be half of my kingdom." Then Esther saw that her time had come. She said to the king, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please you, let my life be given me, and the lives of my people. For we have been sold, I and all my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. If only we had been sold as slaves, I would have said nothing, but we are to be slain in order to please our enemy." Then the king said, "Who is this man, and where is he, that dared to do this thing?" "The enemy," said Queen Esther, "is this wicked Haman." As the king heard this, he was so angry that he rose up from the table and walked out into the garden. In a moment he came back and saw Haman fallen down upon his face, begging the queen to spare his life. The king looked at him in anger, and the servants at once covered Haman's face, as one doomed to death. One of the officers standing near said, "There stands the gallows, 75 feet high, which Haman set up yesterday for Mordecai to be hanged upon it." "Hang Haman himself on it," commanded the king. So Haman died upon the very gallows that he had made for Mordecai. And on that day the king gave Haman's place to Mordecai, and set him over the princes. He gave to Mordecai his own ring with its seal. And all the family of Haman, his sons, were put to death for their father's evil doing, according to the cruel usage of those times. The law for the killing of the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month had been made and sent abroad, and no law of the Persians could be changed. But though this law could not be taken back, another law was made that the Jews could defend themselves against any who might try to do them harm. When the day came, most of their enemies feared to harm the Jews, for now they were under the care of the king, and Mordecai, a Jew, stood next to the king, and such of their enemies as tried to kill them on that day were soon destroyed. So everywhere, instead of sorrow and death on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews had joy and gladness. And on the day following the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews kept a feast of thanksgiving to God for his mercy in saving them from their enemies. The same feast was kept on that day every year after, and is still kept among the Jews in all lands, and is called the Feast of Purim. On that feast the story of Esther, the beautiful queen, is read by all the Jewish people. End of Story 15.
Story 16 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Scribe Who Wrote the Old Testament. Ezra 7, 1 to 10:44. From the court of the great king at Shushan we turn once more to the Jews at Jerusalem and in Judea. For a long time after the first company came to the land under Zerubbabel, see Story 104, very few Jews from other countries joined them. The Jews in Judea were poor and discouraged. Many of them had borrowed money which they could not pay, and had been sold as slaves to richer Jews. Around them on every side were their enemies, the idol-worshipping people in the land, and the Samaritans on the north. These enemies robbed them of their crops in the field, and they also constantly sent evil and false reports of them to the Persian governors. Many of the men of Israel had married women of the land not of the Israelite race, and their children were growing up half heathen and half Jewish, unable to talk in the language of their fathers, and knowing nothing of the true God. 90 years after the Jews had come back to the land, Jerusalem was still a small town, with many of its old houses still in ruins, and no wall around it. In those times no city could be safe from its enemies without a wall, so that Jerusalem lay helpless against bands of robbers who came up from the desert and carried away nearly all that the people could earn. Just at the time when the land was in the deepest need, God raised up 2 men to help his people. These 2 men were Ezra and Nehemiah. Through Ezra the people of Judah were led back to their God, to worship him, to serve him, and especially to love God's book as they had never loved it before. And about the same time Nehemiah gave new hope, and courage, and strength to the people by helping them to build a wall around Jerusalem. The work of these 2 men brought to Judea peace and plenty, and led many Jews from other lands to their own country. Ezra was a priest, living in the city of Babylon, though he had sprung from the family of Aaron, the first priest. He was also a prophet, through whom God spoke to his people. But above all, Ezra was a lover of God's book in a time when the book of the Lord was almost forgotten. Nearly all the books of what we call the Old Testament had been written for a long time, but in those days there were no printed books. Each copy was written separately with a pen, and as the labor was great, there were very few copies of the different books of the Bible. And these copies were in different places. One book of the Bible was in one place, another book was in another place. No one man in those times before Ezra had ever owned or had ever seen the whole of the Old Testament in one book or set of books. Ezra began to seek everywhere among the Jews for copies of these different books. Whenever he found one he wrote it out and kept the copy, and also led other men to copy the books as they found them. At last Ezra had copies written of all the books in the Old Testament except the very latest books. They were written very nearly as we have them now, except that his copies were all in Hebrew, the language spoken by the men who wrote most of the Old Testament. Ezra put all these different books together, making one book out of many books. This great book was written on parchment, or sheepskin, in long rolls, as in old times all books were written. When the book was finished, it was called the Book of the Law, because it contained God's law for his people, as given through Moses and Samuel and David and Isaiah and all the other prophets. When Ezra had finished writing this book of the law, he went on a long journey through Babylon to Judea, taking with him the rolls of the book. With Ezra went a company of men whom he had taught to love the law, to write copies of it, to read it, and to teach it to others. These men, who gave their lives to studying and copying and teaching the law, were called scribes, a word which means writers. Ezra was the first and the greatest of these scribes, but from his time there were many scribes among the Jews, both in Judea and in all other lands. For wherever the Jews lived they began to read the Bible and to love it. The time came, soon after Ezra's day, when in every place where the Jews met to worship, at least one copy of all the books in the Old Testament was kept, so that there was no more danger that the Bible, or any part of it, would be lost. You remember that there was only one temple for all the Jews in the world, and only one altar. Upon this one altar, and there alone, was offered the sacrifice every day. But the Jews in distant places needed to meet together for worship, and there grew up among the Jews everywhere what was called the synagogue, a word which means coming together. At first they met in a room, but afterward they built houses for the synagogues, much like our churches. Some of these synagogues were large and beautiful, and in them the people met every week to worship God, to sing the psalms, to hear the law and the prophets read, and to talk together about what they had heard. It was something like a prayer meeting, for any Jew who wished to speak in the meeting could do so. The men sat on mats laid on the floor, the rulers of the synagogue were on seats raised up above the rest, the women were in a gallery on one side, covered with a lattice-work, so that they could see and hear, but could not be seen. And on the end of the room nearest to Jerusalem there was a large box or chest, called the Ark, within which were kept the copies of the books of the Old Testament. Thus, through the synagogue, all Jews in the world listened to the reading of the Old Testament until very many of them knew every word of it by heart. All this came to pass from Ezra's work in copying and teaching the word of the Lord. And Ezra wrought another work almost as great as that of giving the Bible to the world. He taught the Jewish people, first in Israel and then in other lands, that they were the people of God, and that they must live apart from other nations. If they had gone on marrying women of other races, who worshipped other gods, after a time there would have been no Jews, and no worshippers of God. Ezra made some of them give up their wives of other nations, and he taught the Jews to be a people by themselves, keeping away from those who worshipped idols, even though they lived among them. Thus Ezra led the Jews to look upon themselves as a holy people, given up to the service of God, and he taught them to live apart from other nations, with their own customs and ways of living, and very exact in obeying the law of God in the books given by Moses, even in some things that would seem small and not important. They were to be trained age after age in the service and worship of God. It was God's will that the Jews should be separate from other peoples, and very strict in keeping their law, until the time should come for them to go out and preach the gospel to all the world. The Jews even now in our time continue to keep many of the rules that were given to their fathers long ago by Ezra. So next to Moses, Ezra had greater power over the Jews than any other prophet or teacher. End of story 16.
Story number 17 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5. The Nobleman Who Built the Wall of Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 73 of chapter 7. While the good scribe Ezra was at work finding the books of the Bible and copying them and teaching them, another great man was helping God's people in another way. This man was Nehemiah. He was a nobleman of high rank at the court of the great king Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes reigned after Ahasuerus, of whom we read in the story of the beautiful Queen Esther, story 106. Nehemiah was the cup-bearer to the king of Persia at Shushan. It was his office to take charge of all the wine that was used at the king's table, to pour it out and hand the cup to the king. This was an important office, for he saw the king every day at his meals, and could speak with him as very few of even the highest princes could speak. Then, too, the life of the king was in his hands, for if he were an enemy, he could have allowed poison to be put into the wine to kill the king. So the cup-bearer was always a man whom the king could trust as his friend. Nehemiah was a Jew, and like all the Jews, felt a great love for Jerusalem. At one time, a Jew named Hanani and certain of his friends, who had come from Jerusalem, visited Nehemiah. Nehemiah asked them, "How are the Jews in Jerusalem doing? How does the city look?" And they answered, "The people who are living in the land of Judea are very poor, and are looked down upon by all around them. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When Nehemiah heard this, he was filled with sorrow for his city and his people. After the Jews left him, he sat down for days and would eat nothing. He fasted and wept and prayed. He said, "O Lord God of heaven, the great God who keeps his promises to those who love him and do his will, hear, O Lord, my prayer for the people of Israel, thy servants. We have done very wickedly, O Lord, and because of our sins, thou hast scattered us among the nations. Now, O Lord, give me grace this day in the sight of this man, the king of Persia, and may the king help me to do good and to help my people in the land of Israel." A few days after this, Nehemiah was standing beside the king's table, while the king and queen were seated at their meal. As he poured out the wine, the king saw that his face was sad, which was not usual, for Nehemiah was of cheerful spirit, and generally showed a happy face. The king said to him, "Nehemiah, why do you look so sad? You do not seem to be sick. I am sure that there is something that gives you trouble. What is it? Tell me." Then Nehemiah was afraid that the king might be displeased with him, but he said, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies waste, with its walls broken down and its gates burned with fire?" The king said, "Do you wish to ask of me any favor? Tell me what I can do to help you." Then Nehemiah lifted up a silent prayer to God and said, "May it please the king, I would be glad if you would send me to Jerusalem in the land of Judah with an order to build the walls." The king said, "How long will the journey be, and when will you come back?" Nehemiah fixed upon a time and told the king how long it would be, and he asked also that he might have letters to the men who ruled the different provinces through which he would pass, for them to give him a safe journey, and also a letter to the keeper of the king's forest, to give him wood for the beams of a house which he wished to build, and for repairing the temple and for building the wall. The king was kind to Nehemiah, and he gave him all that he asked. Nehemiah, with a company of horsemen and many friends, made the long journey of almost 1,000 miles to Jerusalem. All the people were glad to have a visit from a man of such high rank, and the whole city rejoiced at his coming. But Nehemiah was distressed as he saw how poor and mean and helpless the city lay. One night, without telling any of the men in the city his purpose, he rose up with a few of his friends, and by the light of the moon rode on his horse around the city. There he saw in how many places the walls were mere heaps of ruins, and gates were broken down and burned. He found great heaps of ashes and piles of stone, so that in some places his horse could not walk over them. The next day he called together the rulers of the city and the chief priests, and he said to them, "You see how poor and helpless this city lies, without walls or gates, and open to all its enemies. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, so that no longer other people may look upon us with contempt." Then he told them how God had heard his prayer and had made the king friendly, and had sent gifts to help them. Then the people and the rulers said, "Let us rise up and build the wall." So at once they began the work. Each family in Jerusalem agreed to build a part of the wall. The high priest said that he would build one of the gates, and the wall beside it to a certain tower. Some of the rich men built a long space, and others did very little, and some would do nothing. One man built just as much of the wall as would stand in front of his house, and no more, and another man only as much as fronted upon his own room. One man and his daughters hired workers to build. The goldsmiths built some, and so did the apothecaries, the men who sold medicines, and the merchants built a part. Almost all the men of the city and some of the women took part in the building, for the people had a mind to work. Soon the news went abroad through Judea and the lands around that the walls of Jerusalem were rising from their ruins. There were many who were far from pleased as they heard this, for they hated the Jews and their God, and they did not wish to see Jerusalem strong as it had been of old. The leader of these enemies was a man named Sanballat, who came from Samaria, where all the people were jealous of the Jews. "What are these feeble Jews doing?" said Sanballat. "Do they intend to make their city strong? Will they pile up stones out of the rubbish of the burned city?" And his servant Tobiah was with him, saying, "Why, if a fox should go up, he could break down their little wall." The Arabians from the desert, and the Philistines from Ashdod on the plain, and the Ammonites from the east of Jordan saw that if the wall should be built, they could no more rob and plunder the city. They tried to form an army to come against the city and stop building. But Nehemiah prayed to God for help, and he chose watchmen who should go around the wall and look out for the coming of the enemies. Half of Nehemiah's men worked on the wall, and the other half held the bows and spears and armor of the workers. And in some places, a man would hold a spear in one hand, while he spread mortar with the other. At other places, men walked with their swords hanging at one side, ready for the fight any moment. Nehemiah rode on his horse around the wall, and his servant walked beside him with a trumpet. He said, "The work is large, and you are apart from each other. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, leave your work, take your arms, and go to the place where it sounds, and there the Lord will fight for us." But their enemies were not strong enough to fight the Jews. So Sanballat and Tobiah and another of their leaders named Geshem sent a letter to Nehemiah saying, "Come and meet us in one of the villages on the plain near the Great Sea, and let us talk over this matter." Now Nehemiah knew that to go to this place and then come back again to Jerusalem would take more than a week. And he sent answer thus, "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down and talk with you?" Over and over again they sent for Nehemiah, but he refused to come. Finally, Sanballat sent a letter with this message: "It is told among all the people, and Geshem says it is a fact, that you are building this city to rebel against the king of Persia and to set up a kingdom of your own. Come now and let us talk with you, or trouble may come to you." Nehemiah wrote back, "You know very well that there is no truth in all these stories. You have made them up yourselves. Some of the Jews in the city were friendly to these enemies outside, and these men tried to frighten Nehemiah. One of them made believe that he was a prophet and said to Nehemiah, 'Go into the temple and hide, for in the night your enemies will come to kill you.' Should such a man as I am run away and hide himself?" said Nehemiah. "No, I will not go." So earnestly did the men of Judah work that in 52 days after the work was begun, it was finished, and the gates were hung, and guards were placed within, so that no enemies might enter. Thus Jerusalem began to rise from its weakness and helplessness, and once more to be a strong city. End of story number 17.
Story 18 of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut. Part 5. Ezra's Great Bible Class in Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 1 to chapter 13 verse 31. Malachi chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 4 verse 6. When the wall of Jerusalem was finished, Nehemiah called together all the Jews from the villages and cities in the land to meet in Jerusalem. They met, a great company with their wives and children, in an open place before the temple. Ezra, the good priest and scribe, who had wrought so great a work in bringing together and writing the books of the Old Testament, was in the city at that time. They asked Ezra to bring the book and to read the law of the Lord to the people. He came, carrying with him the great rolls upon which the law was written, and stood up on a pulpit which they had built, where all the people could see him. And with Ezra were men whom he had taught in the law, so that they could teach it to others. When Ezra stood up in the pulpit, above the heads of the people, and unrolled the scroll, all the people who had been sitting upon the ground rose up, while Ezra gave thanks to the Lord, who had given to them his law. Then the people said, "Amen," with a loud voice, and they bowed until their heads touched the ground and worshipped. Then Ezra began to read in the book aloud, so that as many people as possible could hear. But as the people did not all understand the old Hebrew tongue in which the book was written, men were chosen to stand by Ezra, and as he read each sentence, these men explained it to the people, while all the people stood listening. So, as Ezra read, these men told its meaning, so that the people could understand the word of the Lord. Many of the people had never heard God's law read before, and they wept as they listened to it. But Nehemiah, who was there as the ruler, said to them, "This day is holy to the Lord. Do not mourn nor weep, but rather be glad, and eat and drink, and send gifts of food to those who are in need, for you are strong in the Lord, and should be joyful." And the Levites quieted the people, saying, "Hold your peace, for the day is holy. Do not weep, but be glad in the Lord." And all the people went home to feast and to be glad, because they could hear and understand the words of God's law. After this, another great meeting was held, and the people confessed their sins before God, and the sins of their fathers in forsaking God's law and in not doing his will. And all the people made a solemn promise that they would keep God's law and would do his will, that they would be God's people, and no more give their sons to marry women who did not worship the Lord, that they would keep holy God's day, the Sabbath, and they would give to the Lord's house for all the offerings. And they wrote the promise on a roll, and all the princes and rulers and priests signed it and placed their seals upon it. Nehemiah had now finished the work for which he had made the long journey to Jerusalem. He went back to Shushan, and stood once more in his place, pouring the wine at the king's table. But after some years he came again to Jerusalem. He found that not all the people had fulfilled their promises to serve the Lord, and especially that the Sabbath day was not kept as it should be. People were treading wine presses and bringing into the city loads of grain and selling wine and grapes and figs on the Sabbath day. And men from the city of Tyre, beside the great sea, who were not worshippers of the Lord, brought in fish and sold them on the Sabbath. When Nehemiah saw all these evils, he was greatly displeased, and said to the rulers of the city, "Why do you allow these evil things to be done, and the Sabbath day to be broken? Were not these the very things that made God angry with our fathers, so that he let this city be destroyed? Will you bring God's anger upon us again by doing such things on God's holy day?" Then Nehemiah gave orders that before the sunset, on the evening before the Sabbath, the gates of the city should be shut and not opened until the morning after the Sabbath was over. The men came with their things to be sold, and waited outside for the gates to be opened. Nehemiah looked over the wall and saw them, and said to them, "What are you doing here? If you come here again on the Sabbath, I will put you in prison." Then they went away, and came no more upon the holy day. By such strong acts as these, Nehemiah led the people to a more faithful service of the Lord. And after this, Jerusalem grew large and strong, and was full of people. And Jews from other lands began to come to live in the land, until it was once more filled with cities and towns, and the hills over all the land were covered with vineyards and oliveyards, and the plains were waving with fields of grain. A little after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, Malachi arose as the last of the prophets of the Old Testament. "Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord shall suddenly come to his temple. Behold, he cometh, saith the Lord. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great day of the Lord shall come. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers." And with these words, the Old Testament ends. End of story 18. End of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible by Jesse Lyman Hurlbut, Part 5.